Hey, come on in. Pull up your blanket, find that one comfortable spot you always go back to, and let tonight belong entirely to you. Because I have a story for you. One that starts not with a throne, not with a golden palace, not with the most powerful man in Europe. It starts with a rainstorm, and a husband and wife who could barely stand to be in the same room together. Here is something nobody tells you about the most famous king who ever lived, Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who built Versailles, who made Europe tremble, who ruled for 72 years, and is still the longest reigning monarch in recorded history, should never have existed at all. His parents had been married for 23 years, and in all that time they had produced nothing but heartbreak. 4 pregnancies that ended in silence, 4 babies who never drew a breath, a marriage so cold and so fractured that the King and Queen of France barely shared the same hallways, let alone the same bed. So how exactly did one of the most consequential human beings in Western history come into the world? Well, it rained. Before we go any further into tonight, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, the kind that takes history and turns it into something that actually feels alive, I would love it if you gave this video a like, maybe left a comment down below, or shared it with someone who loves a good story before bed. And hey, where are you watching this right now? Your couch, your bedroom. Some of you I know are lying in the dark with your phone 6 inches from your face, and I respect that completely. Tell me about it down in the comments. I genuinely love hearing from you. Now, soften those lights a little, let the room breathe, and let us travel together back to the court of France in the autumn of 1637. To understand Louis XIV, you have to understand where he came from. Not just politically, not just dynastically. You have to understand the silence between his parents. Louis XIII and Anne of Austria had been married in November of 1615, when both of them were just 14 years old. 2 children really handed to each other across the border of France and Spain, like pieces in a diplomatic chess game. Their union was never about love. It was about alliance, about power, about the ancient need of kingdoms to bind themselves together through blood. And almost from the very beginning it was a disaster. Louis XIII had little warmth for his young Spanish bride. He spent years ignoring her, choosing in fact the company of his male favourites at court, leaving Anne isolated, watched perpetually under suspicion. She was foreign, she was Spanish, and France was at war with Spain for much of this period, which meant that Anne of Austria, Queen of France, was essentially treated as an enemy in her own palace. She was watched. Her letters were intercepted. Her servants were spies. Cardinal Richelieu, the brilliant and ruthless minister who ran France in all but name, kept her under constant surveillance. And through all of it she waited for children that never came, 4 stillbirths. There is particular cruelty in those 2 words that history tends to gloss over too quickly. 4 times this woman gathered hope. 4 times she lost it. And each time the court, the entire country really, watched and judged and whispered. By the time she was in her mid-30s, most of France had given up on her. The whispers had turned to something louder. Surely the marriage would be annulled. Surely the king would find another queen who could give France what it needed. And then December of 1637 arrived. The exact details have been debated by historians for centuries, but what most accounts agree on is something almost embarrassingly simple. It rained. The king was travelling plans, change shelter was needed, and Louis XIII found himself spending an unexpected night in the apartments of his estranged wife at a royal residence outside of Paris. 9 months later, on the 5th of September 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Anne of Austria gave birth to a living son. The official newspaper of France, the Gazette de France, called it, and I want you to really hear this phrase, a marvel when it was least expected. France did not just celebrate, France lost its mind with joy. Bells rang in churches across the country. Bonfires were lit in the streets of Paris. People wept in public. Actual, genuine tears of relief because the succession had been secured, because the dynasty would continue, because France had an heir. The baby was named Louis Dieudonne, Louis given by God. Now, stop and sit with that for a moment. This child, this small, squalling, entirely ordinary-looking infant, was named as though he had been delivered directly by divine hands, not by medicine, not by biology, by God. And that name was not just a sentiment. It was a political statement. It was a theological declaration. It was the beginning of a mythology that would shape everything Louis XIV would ever do or believe about himself. Because when you are told from the moment you take your first breath that you are a gift from God, when your very existence is framed as a miracle, what does that do to a person? What happens when a child grows up not just as royalty, but as something almost beyond human? We will come back to that question throughout this entire series because the answer is complicated and fascinating, and more than a little heartbreaking. But for now, let us stay here in this moment of extraordinary joy and let it settle. Anne of Austria was 37 years old when Louis was born. 37 by the standards of 17th-century France was not young for a first birth. She had waited 23 years. She had survived 4 losses. She'd endured decades of suspicion and isolation. And according to contemporaries who knew her, she adored this child with a ferocity that surprised even the court. Historical accounts tell us that Anne would spend almost all of her time with young Louis. She shared with him her 2 great passions, food and theatre. She spoke to him warmly, held him close, gave him a tenderness that was genuinely uncommon in royal households of the era where children were typically handed off to governesses and nurses and seen at scheduled hours. From his mother, Louis learned what it felt like to be loved without condition. From his father's absence, he learned something else entirely. Louis XIII died of tuberculosis in May of 1643, when little Louis was not quite 5 years old. The child who had become the most powerful ruler in Europe inherited a kingdom before he understood what a kingdom was. And here is the part that I think tends to get lost beneath all the gilded mythology. That little boy was terrified. Not immediately, of course. Children of 4 and 5 do not yet have the vocabulary for the weight being placed on them. But the fear came soon enough. France in the 1640s was not a peaceful place. The great nobles, those ancient, proud, spectacularly difficult aristocrats who'd been grinding against royal authority for generations, had been waiting for exactly this moment. A child king, a regency, a window of vulnerability. What followed was a period of civil chaos known as the Fronde, a series of uprisings and rebellions that convulsed France between 1648 and 1653. And the word Fronde, by the way, means sling, as in a slingshot, named after the children who used to hurl stones at the carriages of wealthy Parisians. There is dark sense of humour in that detail that I appreciate. During the Fronde, the young king and his mother were forced to flee Paris not once but multiple times. They were effectively prisoners in their own country, dependent on Cardinal Mazarin's political manoeuvring to survive. But the moment that historians keep returning to, the moment that seems to have lodged itself deepest in Louis's psyche, happened not in flight, but in stillness. There was a night during those years when a mob forced its way into the royal palace. They demanded to see the king to confirm with their own eyes that he had not been spirited away. Anne of Austria made a decision. She brought the men to Louis's room, and the young king lay in his bed and pretended to sleep while strangers stood over him in the dark, studying his face, whispering among themselves. He was by most accounts somewhere between 9 and 10 years old. He was awake through every moment of it. Think about what that experience does to a child. To lie perfectly still, to control your breathing, to perform calm and sleep and serenity, while your heart is hammering and the world around you feels like it could collapse at any moment, that is not just a memory, that is a training. That night planted something in Louis XIV that would grow and calcify over decades into one of the most extraordinary capacities for emotional control that any European monarch ever demonstrated. He learned at 9 years old that a king does not show fear. That composure is armor, that the performance of power is inseparable from power itself, and it also planted something else, a distrust of Paris so deep he would eventually abandon it entirely, a distrust of the nobility so fundamental it would reshape the entire architecture of French government, and a need, quiet, persistent, almost obsessive, to make himself the undeniable, unchallengeable centre of everything, not out of vanity, or not only out of vanity, out of survival. So here is where we are as part 1 draws to a close and the real story is only just beginning to breathe. Louis XIV arrived in the world through a coincidence of reign and estrangement, named as a miracle by a nation desperate for one. He was loved extravagantly by his mother and shaped profoundly by his father's distance. He inherited a throne at 4 years old and nearly lost everything by 10. The man who would build Versailles, who would reshape European power, who would take 17 mistresses and love some of them with a ferocity that would astonish you. That man was first a frightened boy lying still in the dark, pretending not to feel anything at all. And in the next part of this story we're going to go even deeper, because that boy did not simply grow up. He was educated, deliberately, carefully, ruthlessly, in the art of being a king. And somewhere in that education, Louis XIV made a decision that changed everything, not just for himself, but for every noble in France, every mistress who loved him, every woman who thought she could reach the real man beneath the golden surface. That decision, and what it cost everyone around him, is exactly where we are headed next. Stay close. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being raised for greatness. Not the ordinary loneliness of a child left alone in a room, something stranger, quieter, and far more difficult to name. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who do not see you as a person at all, who look at your small hands and your child's face and see instead a dynasty, a bloodline, a theological argument about the will of God. Louis XIV knew that loneliness before he knew almost anything else. And the man it produced, brilliant, controlled, magnificent, and in certain quiet ways profoundly isolated, was shaped not by privilege as most people assume, but by something much more complicated. By a classroom without walls, by a tutor who taught through crisis rather than books, and by one morning in March of 1661 when a 22-year-old finally stood up, looked his court in the eye and said no more. That morning changed the history of Europe. But to understand it, you have to understand what came before. When Cardinal Mazarin died on the 9th of March 1661, the court of France went into a particular kind of frenzy. Not grief exactly. Well, some grief. Mazarin had been formidable, brilliant, genuinely irreplaceable, but the frenzy was really about what came next. Because in the 17th century, a king without a chief minister was essentially unthinkable. France had been run by powerful ministers for decades. Richelieu before Mazarin himself for 18 years. The nobility, the secretaries, the great officers of state, all of them assumed almost without question that when the old cardinal breathed his last, a new one would step forward to fill the void. The courtiers jockeyed. The ambitious women of the court, and there were many, made their calculations. The financial officers positioned themselves. Everyone was waiting for Louis to announce the name of his new first minister. Instead, on the morning of March the 10th, the 22-year-old king summoned his ministers and delivered words that no one in that room had been expecting. He said, "It is now time that I govern my affairs myself." He told them that they would assist him with counsel when he asked. He told them that nothing was to be signed, not even a passport, without his personal command. He told them to render account to him directly every single day and to favour no one. The room was reportedly stunned into silence. One historian described it as a declaration so audacious it was almost impossible to process in real time. No French king had assumed full personal rule like this in living memory, not since Henry IV decades earlier. The courtiers had spent years watching Louis defer quietly to Mazarin, watching him observe and listen and wait. They had mistaken that patience for weakness. They were very wrong. But here is the question worth sitting with, really. Where did that come from? How does a man arrive at 22 years old with the internal architecture to say that, and mean it, and then actually do it for the next 54 years without wavering? The answer, I think, is Mazarin. There is a version of Mazarin that history sometimes gives us, the greedy, unpopular, foreign-born minister who amassed a personal fortune so staggering that Voltaire later estimated it at 200 million francs, while the people of France went hungry. That version is not inaccurate, but there is another version of Mazarin that tends to get overlooked in popular retellings, the version who spent the last years of his life teaching a young king how to be extraordinary. Cardinal Jules Mazarin was Italian-born, deeply intelligent, masterful at the kind of political chess that keeps nations alive. He was also, in a genuinely complicated way, someone who loved Louis. He was the boy's godfather. He had spent the years of Louis's childhood keeping France from fracturing, navigating the Fronde, protecting the throne. And when it became clear that his own health was failing, Mazarin made a decision that reveals something rather remarkable about his character. He decided to give everything he knew to the young king. The education Mazarin gave Louis was not the kind you find in school books. It was not Latin and philosophy and the classics, though Louis had that too from other tutors. Mazarin's curriculum was something harder to name and far more useful. He taught Louis the secret of personal rule, which at its core meant this: never let any single person accumulate more power than you. Never cede the centre. Keep even your most trusted advisers at a deliberate, careful distance. Know more than anyone believes you know, and reveal less than anyone expects you will. He shared with Louis his vast personal knowledge of European courts, the grudges, the loyalties, the hidden pressures, the pressure points that could move kings and negotiators. He showed him how intelligence networks actually worked. He brought him to council meetings not to perform leadership, but simply to listen, to absorb, to develop the instinct for how power actually moved, rather than how it appeared to move. And critically, Mazarin taught Louis to be patient. This is perhaps the least appreciated quality of Louis XIV, his patience. Most people think of him as impulsive, a man who built Versailles on extravagant impulse, who fought wars on sudden ambition. But the historical record tells a different story. This was a man who watched and waited for years while Mazarin held the reins, who sat through the humiliations of the Fronde without revealing what he was planning, who waited until the exact right moment, the morning of March the 10th, 1661, to make his move. That patience was not natural, it was learned. And it was learned in the most difficult classroom imaginable. Let me take you back for a moment to the early 1650s, because I think this period of Louis's life deserves more attention than it usually receives. Louis was roughly 12, 13, 14 years old during the worst years of the Fronde. Think about what that means concretely. He was an adolescent, already past the strange night in the royal chambers, where the mob had stood over him pretending to confirm he was still alive, already carrying the weight of a name that meant God-given, and he was watching the country he was supposed to rule tear itself apart. There is a detail from those years that I keep returning to. At one point, the young king and his mother were forced to leave Paris in such haste that they had almost nothing with them. Accounts from the period describe Louis sleeping on straw, The King of France, the Sun King in embryo, sleeping on straw like a common soldier, because there was simply nothing better available. He never forgot it. When you read about the extraordinary luxury of Versailles later in Louis's reign, the gilded everything, the impossibly elaborate ceremonial, the obsessive control over every physical detail of the palace, you could read it as vanity. And there is certainly vanity in it. But there is also something else entirely. There is the memory of a teenager who slept on straw and swore somewhere in the private part of himself that never reached his public face, that no one would ever have reason to doubt his power again, not through violence, not through brute force, but through spectacle so overwhelming that the very idea of challenging him would seem to any rational observer simply absurd. That was the plan, and it worked. For a long time, it worked brilliantly. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known someone who seemed completely in control, someone who always appeared calm, composed, unrattled, while underneath you sensed there was something else entirely going on? Because that is more or less what Louis XIV was and what he had to teach himself to be from a very young age. The Duc de Saint-Simon, a minor nobleman who spent years at Versailles and left behind some of the most vivid first-hand accounts of court life that we have from this period, described Louis's public composure with a kind of awed fascination. He wrote that Louis was almost impossible to read, that he could receive terrible news, the death of a loved one, a military disaster, a financial catastrophe, and his face would remain so still, so controlled, that you could not tell whether he had heard or understood. This was not coldness. At least not always. Saint-Simon, who was often harshly critical of the king, also recorded moments when the mask slipped, when Louis wept in private, when his voice lost its measured quality, when grief or tenderness or fear briefly crossed that magnificent face before being pressed back down. What Louis had was not the absence of feeling. It was supreme, practiced lifelong mastery over the expression of feeling. And Mazarin, shrewd, pragmatic, deeply political Mazarin, understood that this capacity was the single most important thing a king could possess. More important than military genius, more important than wealth, more important than physical beauty or eloquence or any of the other tools of power. Because a king who cannot be read cannot be manipulated, and a king who cannot be manipulated cannot be broken. When Mazarin died, he left Louis something else as well, something that biographers tend to mention briefly before moving on, but which I think deserves a longer look. He left him a blueprint for Versailles, not the architectural plans. Those came later from brilliant designers like Levaux and Lenotre and Mansart. What Mazarin left Louis was the psychological blueprint, the concept of the court as a controlled environment, the idea that if you bring the most dangerous people in the country to a single location of your choosing, surround them with luxury so overwhelming that their sense of practical reality is slightly distorted, and then design every interaction, every ceremony, every room, every symbolic gesture, as a reminder of your own centrality, you have created something more durable than any army. You have created a system of dependence. Here is how the Duc de Saint-Simon described what happened when a nobleman fell out of royal favour at Versailles, and this is devastating actually. He recorded that the worst thing Louis could say about a courtier, the phrase that was effectively a social execution, was this: "He is a man I never see." Not "he is incompetent," not "he is a traitor," not "I dislike him." Simply, "I never see him." Think about what that means in a system designed entirely around proximity to the king. To be unseen was to be nothing. To be absent, whether by choice or by dismissal, was to lose access to patronage, influence, promotion, financial support, everything. The great nobles of France, men whose ancestors had led armies and governed provinces with genuine independence, found themselves reduced to competing for the honour of handing Louis his shirt in the morning. And what is both fascinating and slightly chilling is that many of them genuinely wanted to. That is the genius of it. Louis did not simply force the nobility into Versailles, he made them need to be there. He turned presence at court into the currency of survival. One of the noblemen of the period recorded in contemporary sources described life at Versailles with a phrase that stuck. He called it a gilded cage, and then went right back to competing for a place inside it. Louis had learned from a decade of trauma that the most dangerous people are the ones you cannot see, so he made sure he could see everyone. But here, and this is the part of the story I find most quietly fascinating, is where the personal and the political begin to blur in ways that are genuinely moving if you allow yourself to look closely. Because this system Louis created was not just about control. It was also, I think, about a very human and very understandable need to never again feel what he had felt as a child. Never again feel powerless. Never again feel the crowd pressing into his room in the dark. Never again sleep on straw while the country he was supposed to rule decided whether to respect him or destroy him. In his private memoirs, which he wrote remarkably in his own hand, addressing them to his son and heir as a kind of treatise on the art of kingship, Louis wrote with unusual honesty about the burden of the role he'd been given. He described the work of kingship as something that demanded everything, left nothing in reserve, consumed a man completely. He wrote about the loneliness of command with a candour that surprises many readers who expect only the Sun King's public voice. He wrote, "The function of kings consists principally of allowing good sense to act, which always acts naturally and without effort." It sounds almost effortless, doesn't it? That phrase, allowing good sense to act naturally. But the key word, the one that tells you everything, is allowing. Not commanding, not forcing, allowing. This was a man who had spent his entire youth learning that control, real lasting control, was not seized through violence or proclamation. It was created through systems so elegant and so total that the people within them barely noticed they were being managed at all. In that sense, what Mazarin built in Louis's mind was not a king. It was something closer to an architect of human behaviour, and so we arrive at 22, at March the 10th, at the morning when the young king stood before his ministers and told them in so many words the game has changed. The courtiers who had miscalculated, who'd spent the final months of Mazarin's illness assuming they understood what was coming, scrambled to reorient. Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances, who had been quietly positioning himself as the natural successor to Mazarin's power, found himself facing the full weight of a very different reality. He'd thrown a party at his magnificent chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte that summer, a party so lavish, so breathtaking in its display of personal wealth that contemporaries described Louis as arriving as an honoured guest and leaving as something rather different. Louis had looked around the splendour of Fouquet's chateau. He had looked at the fountains, the art, the sheer, almost provocative extravagance of it. And he had thought, quietly with perfect composure revealing nothing, that a man who could build this on money that was not entirely his own was a problem that needed solving. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested on charges of embezzlement. He spent the rest of his life in prison, and Louis began almost immediately to build something of his own, something that would make Vaux-le-Vicomte look by comparison like a pleasant country house. A child who had once slept on straw was about to build the most extravagant palace the Western world had ever seen. But before we get to Versailles and everything it contained, all the ceremony and the golden rooms and the extraordinary, complicated, intensely human dramas that played out within its walls, there is something else we need to talk about first. Because before Louis was the Sun King, before he was the architect of absolute power, before he was anything the world would remember, there was a young man who fell helplessly, hopelessly in love, and who was made to give that love up. And that story, quiet and personal and still somehow larger than any palace, is exactly what comes next. Something happened to Louis XIV in the summer of 1658 that his ministers, his tutors, and even Mazarin himself had not fully anticipated. He fell in love. Not the practiced diplomatic sort of love that courts arrange between dynasties, but the real, inconvenient, completely irrational kind. The kind that makes a 20-year-old king lose weight and sleep badly, and become, according to his physicians, visibly unwell when separated from the person causing the problem. The person causing the problem was named Marie Mancini, and the story of what happened between them and what it cost them both is one of those chapters of history that reads less like a royal chronicle and more like the ending of a novel you didn't want to finish. To understand how this happened, you need to picture the French court in the mid-1650s. It is not yet Versailles. Versailles is still mostly a hunting lodge and a dream. The court moves between Paris, Fontainebleau, Compiègne, Saint-Germain, a continuous, restless procession of carriages and trunks, and 1,000 people relocating themselves every few weeks. Among those 1,000 people arriving in 1655 was a 17-year-old Italian girl, who by her own family's assessment had very little going for her. Marie Mancini was the third of 5 sisters' nieces of Cardinal Mazarin brought to France by their widowed mother in hopes of favourable marriages. She'd spent part of her childhood in a convent recovering from illness. Her mother, by nearly every account we have, was unkind to her. In fact, the woman's deathbed instruction to Mazarin was reportedly to shut Marie in a convent and keep her there, because a horoscope had predicted the girl would cause trouble. On this particular point, the horoscope was not wrong. Marie was not, by the standards of French court beauty, the most obviously dazzling of the Mancini sisters. Her older sister Olympia had already briefly caught Louis's wandering eye. But Marie had something that the court found difficult to categorize. She was genuinely, deeply, arrestingly intelligent. She read widely philosophy, literature, the great Italian poets. She could hold a conversation that went somewhere unexpected. She was vivacious in the French meaning of the word, which captures something more than mere cheerfulness, an aliveness, a quality of being wholly present in a way that made everything around her feel slightly more interesting than it had been a moment before. And crucially, she was honest with Louis in a way that very few people in his life had the freedom to be. Now, how does a young king actually fall in love with someone when that young king is surrounded by people whose entire professional purpose is to manage and shape his emotional life? The answer in this case was illness. In the summer of 1658, Louis fell gravely ill with what was likely a severe fever. Some historians believe it may have been typhoid. His condition deteriorated rapidly enough that his physicians administered the last sacraments. The court went into a particular kind of controlled panic. Letters were prepared, contingencies were discussed, and Marie Mancini, who was at court at the time, and who'd been in Louis's circle for several months, reportedly collapsed in genuine grief. She wept. She prayed without ceasing. She was by all accounts not performing appropriate royal concern. She was simply helplessly, undisguisedly devastated at the thought of him dying. Louis recovered, and when he did, someone told him about Marie's response. He was apparently undone by it. Think about what that moment meant for him. Here was a man who'd been surrounded since birth by people whose expressions of feeling were all calibrated to political purpose. Every tear at court, every declaration of devotion, every warm word from a minister or a noble, all of it filtered through layers of self-interest. And here was this Italian girl who had simply cried with no audience for no advantage, because she actually cared whether he lived or died. Not the king, him. By autumn of 1658, the two were inseparable. They went riding together at Fontainebleau. They talked, really talked for hours about poetry and philosophy and history. Louis's cousin, La Grande Mademoiselle, noted in her memoirs that Louis was markedly changed by the relationship, warmer, more expansive, more himself. She wrote that he was in much better humour after he fell in love with Mademoiselle Mancini and chatted with everyone. Marie, meanwhile, introduced him to things that would mark him for the rest of his life: a love of music, a deepened understanding of Italian literature, a genuine engagement with the arts that went beyond the performative patronage of a king and into something more personal. She was in some real sense helping him become the man he was going to be, which is exactly why the people around them understood that it had to be stopped. I want to pause here and say something that I think often gets lost in the telling of this story. The conventional narrative frames Marie Mancini as a romantic footnote, the girl Louis almost married before duty called him back, a charming interlude, a youthful episode. But that framing does something unfair to what actually happened and to the people it happened to. Louis was not drifting amiably through a pleasant flirtation. He was, by every account we have from people who knew him at the time, genuinely trying to upend the entire marital and diplomatic strategy of France in order to marry this woman. He went to Mazarin directly and asked not as a lovesick boy, but as a king making a proposal that Mazarin consent to a marriage with his own niece. Mazarin's response was one of the more remarkable things any minister in history has said to his sovereign. He told Louis that he'd been appointed to his position to safeguard the welfare of France, and that he would rather see his niece dead than elevated through what he called the king's blind passion. He would rather see his niece dead. Louis, according to accounts from the period, actually fell to his knees before the cardinal, the King of France, on his knees, begging. It made no difference. Then he went to his mother, Anne of Austria, and the conversation lasted approximately an hour. He was observed leaving it with his eyes red with tears. So here is what I keep turning over in my mind when I think about this story. Two of the people Louis loved most in the world, the man who had been his surrogate father, his teacher, the architect of everything he was becoming as a ruler, and his own mother, who had spent 23 years waiting to have him, and adored him utterly, stood together and told him in the clearest possible language that the person he wanted most was not someone he was permitted to have, and he had to choose. The morning of June the 22nd, 1659, Marie Mancini left the French court. Louis escorted her to her carriage himself. He wept openly, which was for this man an extraordinary thing. The man who'd been trained since childhood never to show fear, never to show weakness, never to let his face reveal what his heart was doing, cried in front of everyone. And as Marie stepped into the carriage, she turned to him and said something that was recorded by a court memoirist named Madame de Motteville, and that was later repeated so many times it became one of the most famous lines in the history of the French court. She said, "Sire, you weep, you are the master, and yet I go." That sentence has been translated and retranslated and paraphrased across 3 centuries, and I think the reason it still lands is because it captures something absolutely true about what was happening. He was the most powerful man in France. He was the Sun King in embryo, the man who would reshape Europe, and she was going. Because the love of a king, it turned out, was not the same thing as the power of a king. Not in this. After her departure, Louis's physicians recorded that he lost weight, slept poorly, and displayed what they diplomatically described as a markedly troubled humour. He arranged on the journey south for his marriage negotiations to detour through the town, where Marie was being kept simply to see her one last time. They were permitted 3 days together according to most accounts. 3 days, and then he left again. In June of 1660, Louis married Maria Theresa of Spain the Infanta at Saint-Jean-de-Luz. The marriage was the diplomatic seal on the Treaty of the Pyrenees, which had ended France's war with Spain. It was from a statecraft perspective a masterpiece of political engineering. Louis behaved correctly. He was kind to Maria Theresa. By all accounts, he treated her with consistent decency, throughout their 23 years together, even when his heart was very thoroughly elsewhere. But he never pretended not in any private document we have to have felt for her what he felt for Marie. Now what happened to Marie herself is a story that deserves more attention than it usually receives. She was sent eventually to marry an Italian prince, Lorenzo Onofrio Colonna, a powerful Roman nobleman. Lorenzo, according to the accounts, was quite genuinely surprised to discover on their wedding night that Marie was still a virgin. Given that she'd spent years in the intimate circle of the King of France, this seemed to him improbable. He had not understood or had been misled about what kind of relationship Louis and Marie had actually had, intense, intellectually consuming, emotionally transformative, and entirely chaste. The marriage produced 3 children, and for a few years it was not entirely miserable. Lorenzo was wealthy, Marie had status. She had survived the most spectacular romantic disappointment a woman of her era could possibly experience, and she had come out of it still largely herself. But then it unravelled. The details are painful. A difficult third birth, a deteriorating relationship, and by May of 1672, a situation so dangerous. Marie later wrote that she had reason to believe Lorenzo intended to kill her, that she fled Rome in the middle of the night with her sister Hortense. She went first to France, hoping, perhaps half expecting, that Louis would protect her. He did not see her. The king did not receive his first love when she appeared on his doorstep 13 years later, a fugitive from the life he had indirectly sent her to. Perhaps it was too complicated. Perhaps too much had changed. Perhaps the memory was something he needed to keep sealed in a particular room of himself that he could not afford to open. What Marie did next is honestly one of the most quietly extraordinary things I've encountered in all of this research. She kept going. She spent the next decades travelling independently across Europe, Spain, France, Flanders, England, at a time when a woman of her station doing anything of the sort without a husband's permission was essentially unheard of. She wrote her memoirs and published them under her own name, making her and her sister Hortense among the first women in France to have done so. She fought legally and personally for the right to live on her own terms, and she kept for her entire life a private correspondence that historians have only recently been able to fully access. She died in Pisa in May of 1715. Louis XIV died in September of the same year. They were born within a year of each other into a world that made their particular kind of love impossible. They died within a few months of each other in the same year. And in all of the decades between June of 1659 and that final year through his marriages, his mistresses, the wars, the splendour, the grief, there is no evidence that either of them forgot what the other had been. Do you ever wonder what kind of man Louis might have become if they had simply been allowed to marry? I find myself returning to that question because I think it actually matters. The Louis who loved Marie Mancini, the one who rode through Fontainebleau and talked about poetry and cried openly at a carriage door, that man was different from the Sun King who would eventually build Versailles and wrap himself in ceremony-like armour. The love affair did not produce the Sun King. The loss of it might have, because what Louis learned in June of 1659 at the age of 20 was a lesson that sat alongside everything Mazarin had ever taught him. He learned that love, however real, however mutual, however genuinely felt, was not something a king could follow without permission. He learned that duty was the cage he lived in, and that no amount of weeping at carriage doors would change the dimensions of that cage. And he spent the rest of his life, I think, trying to decide what to do with that knowledge. Some of his decisions were brilliant, some were extravagant beyond reason, some were lonely in ways that the grandeur of Versailles could never quite conceal. All of them make more sense when you remember the summer of 1658, and a 20-year-old who fell in love for the first time in his life and the carriage that drove away. Because here is the thing about Louis XIV, he did not stop wanting love after Marie. He simply learned to want it differently, more carefully, sometimes more recklessly, with women who would not and could not require him to choose between them and France. And the first woman who stepped into that complicated space, the first one who would be publicly, officially his, stepped into his life just a few years later through a side door that nobody expected for reasons that had almost nothing to do with romance. Her name was Louise, and she was never supposed to be anything more than a distraction. Let me tell you about a con that went spectacularly wrong, or depending on your perspective, spectacularly right. It is April of 1661. Louis XIV has been ruling France for exactly 1 month as sole sovereign. He is 22, recently married, freshly grieving his mentor Mazarin, and already, because apparently that was not enough, entangled in one of the more awkward situations the French court had seen in some time. The problem was Henrietta of England. Henrietta Anne was Louis's sister-in-law. She had just married his younger brother Philippe, known at court simply as Monsieur, and was beautiful, charming, and entirely too interesting for her own good. The king spent a great deal of time in her company, too much time as far as everyone around him was concerned. The whispers were unpleasant and getting louder. Something needed to be done. What they came up with in hindsight was one of the more elaborate and ultimately doomed pieces of social engineering in the history of the French court. It was decided that Louis should appear to be romantically interested in someone else, someone close to Henrietta, someone visible and plausible whose presence near the king would explain away all those long evenings and private conversations. 3 young women were selected, set in his path as one account from the period puts it. 3 decoys. One of them was a 17-year-old girl named Louise de la Vallière, and Louis was supposed to pretend to like her. He was not supposed to actually fall in love with her. He did that anyway. Now, before I tell you who Louise was and what happened to her, I want to make something clear. This is not a simple love story. Nothing involving Louis XIV ever is. This is the story of a woman who walked into a trap she did not know existed, loved genuinely and unwisely, suffered consequences she could not have anticipated, and then, and this is the extraordinary part, found a way to transform her suffering into something that outlasted the court, outlasted the king himself, and left her remembered in Paris as something close to a saint. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Start here, start with the girl. Louise de la Vallière was born in 1644 in the Touraine region of France, into a family of old but modest nobility, the kind of family that had the right bloodline and almost none of the money to go with it. Her father was a military officer who died when she was 7. She grew up without much security, financial or otherwise, and was educated in a household attached to the Orléans branch of the royal family, which is how she ended up in the orbit of the court at all. In April of 1661, she arrived at Fontainebleau as a maid of honour to the new Duchess of Orléans, Henrietta, the woman whose excessive closeness with the king was causing all the trouble. Louise had been at court for approximately 2 months when she became, through no active effort of her own part of the decoy plan. What did she look like, this girl who was not supposed to matter? Contemporary accounts describe her as having blonde hair and blue eyes, a sweet smile, and what one observer called an expression at once tender and modest. She had a small physical imperfection. One leg was slightly shorter than the other, which gave her a faint limp, and she wore specially made shoes to compensate for it. She was not, by the spectacular standards of French court beauty, the most arresting woman in the room, but she had something that was in its own way more remarkable. She had absolutely no interest in being the king's mistress. She wanted to be a nun. Isn't that wonderful? The woman who had become the first official royal mistress of Louis XIV had since childhood been drawn toward a religious vocation. She was deeply, genuinely devout. She found court life uncomfortable and slightly overwhelming. She did not want power. She did not want wealth. She was not calculating. And when Louis, following his court's clever little plan, began paying attention to her, she did not preen. She did not maneuver. She reportedly said, overheard by someone at court, "Ah, if only he were not the king," which is not something a woman with ambitions says. That is something a woman with a heart says. By July of 1661, within about 6 weeks of the decoy plan being put into motion, Louis had fallen genuinely and rather completely for this unintended target. The artifice of the thing had dissolved entirely. Letters were exchanged, real letters, not the ghost-written ones the court had initially arranged. Meetings happened, and Louise, who had spent her brief life doing her best to be modest and invisible, and good, found herself in love with the most powerful man in France. She was not equipped for what came with that. You have to understand something about Louise's position that I think is easy to miss if you are reading this story from a comfortable distance of 3.5 centuries. To become the king's mistress in 17th-century Catholic France was not a glamorous career move. It was, from the perspective of the Church and many in polite society, a serious transgression. The Church made this explicit and loud. Bishop Bossuet, one of the great preachers of the age, delivered sermons at court during this period that were, without naming names, unmistakably directed at the situation. He spoke of adultery. He spoke of sin. He spoke of the eternal consequences for those who lived outside God's law. And Louise, who actually believed all of this, who was not cynical about her faith the way some at court were, heard those sermons and went home and wept. She felt guilty every single day. She was overheard saying at some point during those early years that she loved Louis as a man, not as a king, that the crown adds nothing to the charm of his person. It is one of the most remarkable things any of the women in Louis's life ever said about him. Most of the others were drawn to the power, to the prestige, to what proximity to the king could get them. Louise was drawn to him specifically despite what he was. She found the man somehow in all the ceremony, and that man for his part genuinely loved her, perhaps more purely than he loved anyone in the years that followed. She asked for nothing. She never petitioned for titles or money or influence. When pregnancies had to be concealed, the first child was born in secret in December of 1663, and immediately placed in the care of trusted servants, with Louise returning to court days later as though nothing had happened. She endured the humiliation quietly. She treated the Queen, Maria Theresa, with consistent humility and respect, even as the Queen, who was well aware of the situation, was sometimes deliberately unkind in return. She once fled to a convent in 1662, genuinely not as a performance, because the pressure of her position had become unbearable. Louis, when he heard, rode after her on horseback. He arrived at the convent, persuaded her to return, and she came back, because she loved him, and because she was not yet free. Here is where the story takes a turn that has always struck me as one of the more quietly cruel episodes in this entire chronicle. By around 1666 or 1667, there was a new woman in Louis's orbit. Her name was Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, known at court as Madame de Montespan. She was a marquise, married, dazzlingly beautiful, razor-sharp in her intelligence, and had decided, with the focused determination of someone who views life as a competition, that she intended to become the king's next favourite. Her strategy for achieving this was remarkably direct. She befriended Louise. You have to pause and appreciate the audacity of that. Athénaïs de Montespan, who was planning to replace Louise in the king's affections, cultivated Louise's friendship in order to gain access to the king's inner circle, and Louise, who was guileless in ways that bordered on the saintly, trusted her, welcomed her, introduced her to people, and slowly over the course of about a year watched Louis's attention shift. He, even in a detail that still manages to be quietly devastating after all this time, arranged his rooms so that he could visit Montespan while appearing to be visiting Louise. She was kept in apartments adjacent to those of her replacement, used as a cover story for the new affair because Montespan was married, and the situation needed managing. Louise became a decoy again. This time she knew it. She tried twice more to go to a convent. Both times she was ordered back to court. The king did not want to lose her as a shield for the new arrangement. She was required by royal command to stay. The woman who had never wanted to be a mistress, who had wept over her sins and loved a man who loved her back until he didn't, was now trapped in the court that had never been her natural home, required to remain not for love but for appearances. Can I ask you something? If you were in Louise's position, if you had given up everything, endured, everything, asked for nothing, and then been kept in place, not because you were wanted, but because you were useful, what would that do to you? I ask because I think how you answer that question says something about what kind of person you are. And because I think it says something equally important about what kind of person Louise de la Vallière was, that her answer was, I will pray, I will ask God for forgiveness, and I will wait. She waited until 1674. In April of that year, after years of degrading cohabitation with her replacement, after watching her children grow up at a distance, after enduring the court's barely concealed contempt for a woman who had lost her position, but not yet her obligation to fill it, Louis finally allowed her to leave. What happened next was witnessed by what appears to have been a significant portion of the Versailles court, and it has been remembered ever since as one of the genuinely moving scenes in the story of this reign. Before she left for the Carmelite convent, Louise went to the Queen. She threw herself on the floor at Maria Theresa's feet, and she begged forgiveness. Maria Theresa, who had endured years of public humiliation, who had watched her husband make another woman into a kind of parallel queen, who'd been treated with kindness by this particular woman, but would have had every human right to feel otherwise, wept, and forgave her. The two women, the Queen and the discarded mistress, held each other and cried, and the court watched in what contemporary accounts describe as something between stunned silence and visible emotion. Then Louise went to the Carmelites. She was 30 years old. She spent the next 36 years in that convent living as Sister Louise of Mercy. Not comfortably. Not as a distinguished dowager spending a peaceful retirement in prayer. She chose the harshest version of convent life available to her. She wore rough clothing against her skin as a form of penance. She imposed on herself physical austerities that her confessor apparently had to limit because she was going further than even the Carmelites thought necessary. She prayed for the conversion of, as she once wrote, one she had so loved. She gave away everything, the fortune that had accumulated from years as the king's favourite, the lands, the wealth. All of it went to her surviving daughter. During those 36 years, Louis wrote to her exactly once to seek her approval for their daughter's marriage. Once. The woman who had loved him before there was a Versailles, before the great machine of his reign had fully assembled itself, who had given him children and loyalty and a kind of uncomplicated warmth that the rest of his life would never quite replicate. She received one letter in 36 years. She apparently was not bitter about it. At least nothing we have from her suggests bitterness. What she left behind was a short religious treatise titled Reflections on the Mercy of God, a piece of philosophical and spiritual writing that once it was published decades later was admired for its clarity and its intelligence. Madame de Montespan, the woman who replaced her, the dazzling and dangerous Montespan, eventually sought her out in the convent toward the end of both their lives, asking for spiritual guidance. Louise gave it. She forgave Montespan too. She seems to have forgiven everyone. She died on the 7th of June 1710. The people of Paris, it was said, mourned her as if she were a saint. I think about Louise often when I think about Louis XIV because she represents something that his more celebrated mistresses do not. Not power, not scandal, not the Baroque drama of the affair of the poisons or the secret marriage or any of the other stories that make this reign feel like an opera. She represents the cost of being genuinely loved by someone who could not afford to love you back the way you deserved. Louis XIV was in many ways the greatest personal ruler France ever had. He was brilliant, disciplined, capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary coldness, often within the same relationship. And Louise de la Vallière got the tenderness when it was real, and the coldness when it became useful. And she survived it in a way that frankly says more about her character than anything he ever built. There is one more thing I want to tell you about her, and it is the detail that has stayed with me longest. When her son died, Louis de Bourbon, the Count of Vermandois, who was 16 years old, and died on his first military campaign in 1683, she received the news in the convent. She had not seen him in years. She had given him up as she had given up everything when she entered the Carmelites. Her reported response was this: "I wept at his birth. I will not weep at his death." She meant that his birth had been to her a mark of sin, the birth of a child outside marriage in circumstances she had spent years doing penance for. His death was a release, for him and in some sense for her. I do not know what to do with that exactly. It is not a comfortable statement. It does not fit neatly into any frame we would find acceptable today. But it tells you with terrible precision what 36 years of Carmelite penance can do to a person's relationship with the life they once lived. And what of Louis? What do we make of the man who loved Louise and who let her be used as a screen for the next woman and who wrote to her once in 36 years? I think the honest answer is that it was probably the compromise he made with himself. He'd already learned in 1659 with Marie Mancini that love was not something a king could pursue without limit. He knew the rules, he had accepted them, and Louise, gentle, devout, asking for nothing, was perhaps the woman he allowed himself to love because she fit within the rules. When she stopped fitting, he let her go. Which is in its own way both understandable and devastating, and it leads us almost inevitably to the woman who came next, the woman who emphatically did not fit within any rules, who was louder and more dangerous and more brilliant than Louise, and who left a mark on this reign that was part golden and part shadow. Athénaïs de Montespan was not a woman you drifted into. She was a woman who decided with full deliberation to become the most powerful mistress in France, and she nearly succeeded in becoming something much darker than that. Somewhere in Paris in the year 1667, in a low and darkened room on a street called the Rue de la Tannerie, a woman lay naked on a makeshift altar, while a defrocked priest began to read from a book that had no business being read in a house in France or anywhere else for that matter. The candles around her were black. The chalice was placed on her bare stomach, and the name she was asking the priest to invoke, the name she needed according to everything she believed about the powers at work in the world that ordinary people never saw, was not God. The woman on that altar was among the most celebrated noblewomen in France. Her name was Athénaïs de Montespan, and everything she did that night, or was alleged to have done, she did because she wanted to be loved by a king. Whether the ritual worked is a matter of historical debate. Whether she actually did it at all is a matter that historians are still not entirely settled on. But what is not in dispute, what the record makes absolutely clear, is that something extraordinary happened to Athénaïs de Montespan's life over the decade that followed that night. Something that turned a beautiful but fairly conventional noblewoman into the most powerful unofficial ruler France had seen in a generation. And what is also not in dispute is that she was burned eventually by the same fire she'd been playing with since the beginning. To understand Athénaïs, you need to first understand just how deliberately she built her position at court. This was not a woman who stumbled into the king's orbit the way Louise de la Vallière had. There was nothing accidental about any of it. She was born in 1640 as Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart the Rochechouart family being one of the oldest and most distinguished noble houses in France, with a lineage stretching back centuries. The family was known for something specific, something the Duc de Saint-Simon later described in terms that stick in the memory. They had what he called the Mortemart wit, a way of speaking that was droll and unexpected and cutting, that arrived at observations from directions no one anticipated, and with an edge so fine that the person being observed sometimes did not notice they were bleeding. Athenais had this quality in abundance. She arrived at court by her mid-20s as a lady-in-waiting first to the king's sister-in-law, then to the queen herself, which was either an extraordinary piece of positioning or simply what happened to beautiful, intelligent women of her background at Versailles. She married in 1663 a marquis reasonably well born, if not quite to the level her family felt she deserved. The marriage started warmly enough, and then the court and the king. And the gravitational pull of everything Versailles represented did what it always did to marriages. It made them feel insufficient. Now, the precise moment when Athenais decided, because this was clearly a decision to become Louis XIV's next mistress, is not something history has been able to pinpoint exactly, but the method is fairly well documented. She waited. Both the Queen and Louise de la Vallière became pregnant within months of each other in 1666. The king was by his own habits and nature not inclined towards solitary evenings, when more companionable alternatives existed, and the two women who usually provided those alternatives were temporarily unavailable. Who was there to entertain the king at private dinners during this period? Athenais de Montespan, invited apparently by both the Queen and Louise themselves. This is either the great irony of the era or evidence of a very carefully executed long game, possibly both. What Athenais did with those dinners, by all accounts, was talk. Not prettily, not deferentially, not with the warm and accommodating manner of a woman trying to please. She talked the way she had always talked, sharply, wittily, with a precision that made everything around her feel slightly more alive. She mocked people in ways that made the king laugh. She held opinions. She argued. The Duc de Saint-Simon, not always a generous observer, noted with a kind of unwilling admiration that Athenais had the gift of saying things both amusing and singular, always original, and which no one expected. Not even she herself expected them. Louis, who had been surrounded his entire life by people performing appropriate thoughts, in appropriate words at appropriate moments, found this irresistible. By the middle of 1667 they were lovers. Let's pause here for a moment and consider the particular scandal of this situation, because it was genuinely more complicated than Louis's previous entanglement with Louise. Louise had been unmarried. The church disapproved of the relationship but could frame it in the relatively tidy category of royal misconduct with a willing young woman of no existing commitments. Uncomfortable, but manageable. Athenais was married. Louis was married. This was what the church at the time referred to as double adultery, and the church had opinions about double adultery that it was not shy about expressing. Bishop Bossuet, the same formidable preacher who had thundered from court pulpits about Louise's situation, turned his considerable rhetorical firepower on this new one with even greater force. In 1675, a priest at court actually refused Athenais communion at Easter, in public. Louis appealed directly to the church hierarchy to overrule this. The church hierarchy refused. The couple was formally separated for approximately 1 year, and then quietly, inevitably, they resumed, because that was the nature of this particular relationship. It was not the tender, somewhat heartbreaking love Louis had offered Louise. It was something more volatile, more matched, more genuinely difficult to put down. Athenais challenged him. She disagreed with him. She made him laugh in ways that required genuine cleverness on his part to appreciate. She was, according to Saint-Simon, the epicenter of the court, its pleasures and its fortunes, a source of both hope and terror for ministers and generals alike. That last phrase is important. Hope and terror. Not hope or terror, both simultaneously from the same woman. Meanwhile, her husband. Oh, the husband. The Marquis de Montespan's reaction to discovering that his wife was carrying on with the King of France was, and I want to choose this word carefully, operatic. He did not follow the established convention for cuckolded noblemen of the era, which was to collect whatever advantages the situation offered and maintain a diplomatic silence. He found the situation intolerable, and he wanted everyone to know. He appeared at court and created scenes. He threatened in terms that someone actually wrote down to contract a terrible disease from a brothel and deliberately bring it home to his wife in order to pass it on to the king. He had to be imprisoned briefly to stop him making further disturbances. When he was released and sent to his estate in Gascony, he turned his carriage black and hung large antlers from it to advertise his cuckoldry to everyone along the road. He arrived home and held a mock funeral for his wife, a complete ceremony with mourning clothes and a dummy dressed in her likeness, and formally buried while his 2 young children from the legitimate marriage were required to attend. You have to almost admire the commitment even as you recognize it as completely counterproductive. The man held a funeral for a living person, and the living person was at Versailles thriving, and the children he forced to attend their mother's mock funeral was not the strangest or most damaging element of their childhood. That distinction would come later from different directions entirely. By the early 1670s, Athénius was at the height of her power. Her apartments at Versailles adjoined the king's through a private entrance. She had more children than the actual queen, 7 in total, fathered by Louis VI, of whom were eventually legitimized and given the royal surname de Bourbon. The king built her the Trianon de Porcelaine, a pleasure pavilion in the gardens, because her existing accommodations apparently required supplementing. Madame de Sévigné, one of the great letter writers of the age who observed Versailles with a sharp and affectionate eye, described Athénaïs in terms that make you almost see her magnificent, excessive, magnificent again, the very embodiment of the reign's glory and its extravagance. The women around the king feared her. The ministers calculated her favour. Even her enemies could not deny what she was. She was, as contemporaries put it, without irony, the true Queen of France. And then the question of how she got there and how she stayed there began to get complicated. The affair of the poisons, the scandal that began unravelling in the late 1670s, when a network of fortune-tellers, poisoners, renegade priests, and what we might now politely call alternative spiritual practitioners, was uncovered in Paris, initially seemed to have nothing to do with Versailles. It was a Paris problem, an underworld problem. Aristocratic women buying poisons to remove inconvenient husbands, love potions to attract new ones, that sort of thing. Dark, certainly, but safely distant, until the testimony started accumulating. A woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known throughout Paris simply as La Voisin, was at the centre of the network. She was a fortune-teller, a midwife, an abortionist, and an alleged practitioner of far darker rituals. Her client list, when investigators began to compile it, read like a social register for the court of Versailles. Olympia Mancini was on it. Other names the court recognised were on it. And then gradually, through testimony given by La Voisin under interrogation, and later testimony given by her daughter, and later still testimony from other arrested accomplices, the name Athénaïs de Montespan began to appear. According to these testimonies, Athénaïs had been a client of La Voisin since as early as 1665, before she had even formally become the king's mistress. She allegedly purchased love potions, aphrodisiacs. The testimonies claimed mixed into the king's food over a period of years, and the rituals, if the testimonies are to be credited, escalated from there. A black mass in 1667, just as her relationship with Louis was beginning. Another series of black masses in 1673, when she feared his attentions were wandering, and the priest who officiated at some of these masses, a man named Etienne Guibourg, allegedly described Athénais herself as the human altar, the naked figure upon whom the chalice rested, while he read invocations that no priest in France should have been reading at all. Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, Paris' first Lieutenant General of Police, a meticulous and formidable investigator, examined these testimonies. He noted their inconsistencies. He noted that Lavoisin herself, before her execution by burning in February of 1680, actually denied Athénais's involvement in the worst of it. He noted the incentives for accusers to implicate a famous name. He was, in short, a careful man who did not rush to conclusions. But he also wrote in documents that were sealed at the time and only rediscovered nearly 2 centuries later that he believed some version of the accusations was probably true. Not necessarily the most extreme elements, but something. What did Louis do? He suspended the public proceedings of the investigation after Athénais's name surfaced. He ordered a separate private inquiry instead. He kept Athénais at court. He promoted her to superintendent of the Queen's household, a title which was, as he well knew, the position he offered to women whose real influence had ended. He legitimized more of their children, ensuring that this particular secret could never fully be aired in public without damage to the royal family itself, and in 1709, near the end of his life, he had all the records of the investigation brought to him. He burned them one by one. He did not know that La Reynie had kept a personal copy which was published nearly 2 centuries later. History found out anyway. There is something both terrible and deeply human in that image, an old man alone with documents he has been sitting on for 30 years, feeding them to a fire. Was he protecting Athénaïs, protecting himself, protecting the children they had made together, protecting the crown? All of the above, probably in proportions that varied from document to document as he threw them in. He never knew if she had done it. She never admitted that she had. She went to a convent eventually in 1691 when she lost her temper one too many times with the king and asked for permission to retire, and he granted it before she could change her mind and had her Versailles apartments reallocated within the week. She spent her final years doing what powerful women in that century often did when their power ran out: charity work, religious devotion, an apparent attempt to reconstruct in God's good graces what had been spent in the king's. She died in May of 1707. Louis reportedly refused to allow their children to wear mourning for her. I want to offer you my own honest take on Athénaïs, having sat with this story long enough to have complicated feelings about it. I think she was probably guilty of something. Probably the aphrodisiacs, possibly some version of the rituals. People in that period, even educated aristocratic people, believed in the efficacy of such things, and desperation makes believers of almost everyone eventually. The power she was trying to hold was enormous. The rivals were constant. The fear of losing it was real and rational given the fates of the women who had come before her. But I also think she was being judged by the standards of a world that was happy to accept the benefits of her power, when those benefits flowed outward to artists she patronized, to architects whose work she championed, to the children she bore and raised to prominence, and equally happy to destroy her when those benefits became inconvenient. History has not been entirely kind to Athénais de Montespan. The accusations have stuck, whether proved or not, because they are genuinely extraordinary accusations, and because she was genuinely extraordinary enough to make them feel plausible. What history tends to forget is that the man who burned those documents, the man who built her a private entrance and had 7 children with her and kept her at court even after the investigation began, probably knew more about what she had or hadn't done than anyone alive. He burned the documents anyway, and whatever that decision tells us about Louis XIV's complicated moral architecture, it also tells us something about what the two of them, in whatever fractured and dangerous way, had been to each other. But here is what I find myself returning to after all the darkness of this chapter. While Athénaïs was conducting her court of hope and terror, while her children were being spirited away to a house on the Rue Vaugirard and raised by a widow named Françoise Scarron, a quiet, devout, intelligent woman who had once been a friend of Athénaïs herself, something entirely unscripted was happening in that house on the Rue Vaugirard. The king coming to visit the children began to notice the woman raising them, the woman who would eventually become his secret wife, the woman who would outlast every mistress, every ceremony, every golden room, and become the person who sat beside him at the end of everything. Her name was Maintenon, and her story is not the story you expect it to be. Picture this. A woman sits in an apartment at Versailles doing needlework. She's done this every evening for years. The door opens and in comes the King of France, the Sun King, the most powerful ruler in Europe, the man around whom an entire civilization has learned to orbit. He sits down, he removes his hat, he talks, not as a king, not performing for ministers or courtiers or the hundreds of eyes that follow him through every corridor of that golden palace, just talking about the wars that are going badly, about the ministers who are frustrating him, about the children he is losing one by one to disease. He sometimes cries. She listens. The door is shut and nobody is allowed to enter. This is the private life of Louis XIV at its most stripped down. No ceremony, no audience, no golden room. Just a man in his 60s carrying the weight of a reign that had lasted longer than most human lives in a small apartment with a woman who had given him something none of his mistresses, none of his queens, none of the brilliance of Versailles had ever quite managed to provide. He called it solidity. He called her specifically in front of his ministers sometimes your solidity. The woman he said this to had been born in a prison. There is no stranger origin story in the entire court of Louis XIV than the one that produced Madame de Maintenon. Françoise d'Aubigné entered the world in November of 1635 in the prison of Niort, a town in western France where her father was being held. Not for a minor offence, for counterfeiting and other crimes, serious enough to have earned him a death sentence which was eventually commuted. Her mother was the prison warden's daughter. The circumstances of her conception were by any measure complicated. Her father, once released, took the family on what must have seemed like a hopeful venture, a colonial appointment in the Caribbean on the island of Marie-Galante off Guadeloupe. It did not go well. The man seems to have been constitutionally incapable of consolidating any opportunity that came his way. He left Françoise and her mother behind, moved on, and effectively vanished from their lives. Her mother died not long after. Françoise spent time in convents, time with Protestant relatives who tried to reconvert her from the Catholicism her mother had given her, time in circumstances that the word poverty barely covers. She was at various points genuinely destitute. By the time she was a teenager in Paris, she had already lived more than most people manage in an entire life. She had no money, no family of consequence, no prospects of the conventional kind. What she had was something harder to name and considerably more durable. She had a mind that would not stop working, a quality of stillness that people in her orbit found remarkable, and an ability earned through necessity rather than temperament to make herself useful to whoever was nearby without losing herself in the process. She was what you might call in the frankest possible terms a survivor, not in the grim, diminished sense, in the sense of someone who's been tested repeatedly and discovered that they are at their core, more than whatever their circumstances suggest. In 1652, at the age of approximately 15 or 16, she married a man named Paul Scarron. Now, Paul Scarron was 42 years old, one of the most celebrated satirical poets in Paris, and almost entirely paralyzed by rheumatism. He described his own body with the dark humour that was perhaps his defining characteristic as a sort of human zeed, bent and locked by disease into a shape that made ordinary movement impossible. He could not dress himself. He needed constant care. His apartment was nevertheless one of the most lively literary salons in Paris, because his mind was entirely unaffected by what his body was doing, and his wit was formidable enough that everyone wanted to be in the room. The marriage was by the standards of Versailles, and the aristocracy a bizarre mismatch. People found it amusing. A beautiful young woman of no means wed to a famously disabled middle-aged satirist. The gossip was not kind. What actually happened in that apartment over the 8 years before Scarron died in 1660 was something more interesting than the gossip suggested. Françoise ran the salon. She managed the household. She nursed her husband without complaint. She absorbed through daily proximity to the best literary and philosophical minds of her generation, an education in conversation and ideas that no amount of formal tutoring could have replicated. She became, over those years, exactly the kind of person who could hold the attention of anyone in a room not through beauty alone, though she had that, but through the rarer quality of genuine intelligence, combined with the discipline never to waste a word. When Scarron died, he left her his name and his debts. She was 24 years old, widowed without income, and possessed of an intellect that had nowhere obvious to deploy itself. She got a small pension from the crown. She attended salons. She made friends. And one of those friends made through the intellectual circles of Paris was a dazzlingly beautiful, razor-witted noblewoman she'd come to know before either of them had any idea how their lives would eventually intersect. Athénaïs de Montespan. The irony of what happened next has a quality to it that feels almost fictional, though it was entirely real. In 1669, on the advice of Athénaïs herself, Françoise was hired as governess to the children that Louis XIV and Athénaïs were producing together. This was itself a somewhat delicate arrangement. The children had to be kept off the official record of courthouse separately, their existence managed quietly. They needed someone discreet, capable, and trustworthy. Athénaïs chose her old friend Françoise. Athénaïs, in other words, personally selected the woman who would eventually replace her in the king's life. She would not discover this immediately. For years it seemed entirely under control. Louis visited the house on the rue Vaugirard to see his children. Françoise was there. His initial impression of her, recorded remarkably in historical sources, was that she was unbearable. Too serious, too morally upright, too willing to say quietly difficult things in the middle of pleasant evenings. He found her pious manner annoying, but he kept coming back, because his children adored her, because she clearly cared for them as actual children rather than dynastic complications, and because gradually he discovered that when she said difficult things quietly in the middle of pleasant evenings, she was usually right, something that was genuinely rare in his life. Here is what I think is the most fascinating and underexplored aspect of the relationship between Louis and Françoise, the woman who would eventually become Madame de Maintenon. He was not in love with her the way he had been in love with the others. With Marie Mancini, it had been that overwhelming, paralyzing, almost adolescent love, the kind that makes you fall to your knees and beg your chief minister to change political strategy. With Louise, it had been tenderness, a kind of grateful wonder at being loved simply. With Athénaïs, it had been something wilder and more volatile, matched wits and matched appetites, and a decade of entanglement so intense that he burned documents rather than face what it contained. With Françoise, it was something different, something that took longer to name. He trusted her, not the way you trust an ally in a negotiation, or a minister who manages not to steal from the treasury. The way you trust the one person in a building full of thousands who will tell you the truth without calculating what the truth is worth to them. She had nothing to gain from flattering him, and she knew it, and he knew it, and that knowledge so rare, so precious in the world he inhabited, was something he found himself returning to again and again, The way you return to a window that has an honest view. Princess Palatine, that shrewd and often withering observer of the Versailles court, who is one of history's best witnesses to this period, wrote about the relationship between Louis and Maintenon, with a combination of irritation and grudging acknowledgement. She noted that the king had never been so passionate about any mistress as he was about Maintenon, adding that it was a rather curious thing to see them together. The word she used was passionate, not comfortable, not convenient. Passionate. Whatever was between them, it was not merely companionable. When Queen Maria Theresa died on the 30th of July 1683, Louis reportedly said something that historians have quoted many times, and that never quite loses its sting regardless of how often you encounter it. He said, "She never caused me a moment's grief except by her death." That is either deeply moving or faintly terrible, depending on how you feel about a 23-year marriage being summarized in 12 words. Maria Theresa had been faithful, kind, devout, and largely invisible in the emotional life of the man she had married. She had endured his affairs with consistent grieving dignity. She deserved more of a eulogy, but it is at minimum an honest statement, and Louis was not given to honesty in his public declarations, which makes it worth noting. After her death, something shifted. The court waited for the next chapter, the next mistress perhaps, a new political marriage to another European princess. Instead, sometime in the autumn of 1683, the exact date is disputed with candidates, ranging from October of that year to early 1684, Louis married Françoise d'Aubigné, the woman he had called unbearable 12 years earlier, in secret. There were almost no witnesses. No announcement was made then or ever. No title was given. Françoise was never called queen, never publicly acknowledged, as his wife never permitted to occupy the position that the marriage by any reasonable reading had created. It was what was called a morganatic marriage, a marriage between people of unequal rank, in which the legal and social status of the spouse is not elevated to match the monarch's. She was the secret wife of the most public man in France, and yet within Versailles, behind closed doors, the marriage was apparently the worst-kept secret of the reign. The Princess Palatine knew. Most of the senior courtiers knew or strongly suspected. The papacy, which had clearly been consulted, sent Françoise a lapis lazuli crown for a statue of the Virgin and a gold medal as tokens of papal approval. Discreet, but there. What changed at Versailles after the marriage was subtle but unmistakable. Louis began working in Françoise's apartments. His ministers came to her rooms to report. He spent his evenings there, not in the grand reception spaces of the palace, but in what courtiers described as an almost domestic arrangement. The king at her hearth, doing paperwork, being fed dinner, talking to a woman who would tell him with characteristic quiet firmness what she actually thought. She became, as one observer recorded, the second most powerful person in France, and she wielded that power largely by refusing to wield it in the obvious ways. She did not demand titles. She did not push her relatives into positions of influence with the visible aggression of a Montespan. She did not make enemies unnecessarily. What she did, and this is where her influence is most genuinely contested by historians, was be present consistently for every conversation the king had about anything that mattered. She was in the room when the decisions were made. What role she played in those decisions is something scholars still argue about. She seems to have encouraged his growing religiosity, which intensified markedly after their marriage with Louis, becoming notably more devout, more given to serious Catholic observance, more concerned with the spiritual condition of France. Whether this was her doing or simply the natural arc of an aging king moving toward his God is impossible to determine. What is less ambiguous is that she was in that room in 1685 when Louis signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, the document that revoked the Edict of Nantes and stripped French Protestants, the Huguenots, of the religious freedoms they had held for nearly a century. 200,000 people fled France. Their skills and capital and knowledge went with them to England, to the Netherlands, to Prussia. The economic and cultural damage was enormous and lasting. Did Maintenon push for this, or allow it, or simply fail to push against it? She herself was born into a family with Protestant roots. She had a Protestant aunt who had tried to reconvert her as a child. This is not the biography of a woman who would naturally have wanted to see her childhood religion suppressed. And yet it happened. On her watch, in her presence, with her influence apparently not deployed to stop it. This is the darkest question mark in Maintenon's story, and I don't think anyone has answered it satisfactorily. What I can tell you is that she was not a simple woman, and her silences were as calculated as her words, and the room where the king worked in her apartments overlooking the royal courtyard was not a room where things happened to her. She chose her battles, and some of those battles she chose not to fight. In 1686, 3 years after the secret marriage, she persuaded Louis to fund something that she had apparently wanted for a long time. A school. Not for the daughters of dukes and princes, for the daughters of impoverished noblemen, families with old blood and no money girls who would otherwise have no education beyond what a convent might reluctantly provide. The school at Saint-Cyr, just west of Versailles, opened in 1686 and eventually housed 250 girls. Maintenon designed the curriculum herself. She taught there personally. She wrote educational materials. She spent enormous energy on the question of how to educate young women for lives that would be worth living, not just socially useful, but genuinely intellectually and spiritually nourished. This is, I think, the truest expression of who she actually was. Not the second most powerful person in France, not the secret wife, not the woman history has sometimes blamed for the Huguenot expulsion, or credited with taming the Sun King's more extravagant impulses. Just a woman who had been a child with nothing, who had educated herself through whatever doors happened to open, and who built, when she finally had the resources to build anything, she chose a school for girls who were in the same position she had been. That school is still there. Napoleon converted it into a military academy, which is either ironic or appropriate depending on your perspective. But it stood for a century as exactly what she intended. There is one final thing about Maintenon that I want to tell you because it seems to me to say more about her character than almost anything else in this story. A few days before Louis XIV died in September of 1715, the great king, in his final agony, the court gathered in the usual Versailles way to watch and wait. Françoise left. She did not stay for the death of the man she had secretly married 32 years earlier. The man who had called her your solidity. The man who had come to her room every evening for decades and shut the door and cried sometimes, and been for those hours not a king at all, but simply a person who needed another person to be present. She left for Saint-Cyr, her school, the thing she had built. She lived there for another 4 years, teaching and praying and corresponding until she died in April of 1719 at the age of 83. Nobody who knew her was surprised by any of it. What Maintenon represented in the life of Louis XIV, and what makes her, I think, the most psychologically interesting of all the women who shaped that life, is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every other woman had loved him, or claimed to love him, or positioned herself to benefit from his love. Maintenon did something rarer, and in some ways more demanding. She accepted him. With the full knowledge of who he was, the magnificence and the stubbornness and the loneliness and the increasingly complicated spiritual ledger he was trying to settle as he aged. She accepted it without flinching, without softening it into something more palatable, and without asking for public recognition in return. Kings have majesty, popes have sanctity, you have solidity. He was not wrong about her, and yet, even with all of this, with the secret marriage, the daily conversations, the school he built for her, The 32 years there is something about the way Louis's story ends that suggests even Maintenon's extraordinary steadiness was not quite enough to fill the particular emptiness this man carried, because in his final years as the deaths accumulated, his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, the Versailles, he had built slowly emptying of the people who had made it what it was. Louis XIV began to reckon in a way he had not done before, with the question of what he had actually built and what it had cost. That reckoning is the story of his children, of the extraordinary, strange, sometimes heartbreaking way he loved them, and of the children who outlived him and the ones who did not. That is the chapter waiting just ahead. Of all the complicated things about Louis XIV, his relationship with his children is perhaps the one that most resists easy summary. And I say that having spent considerable time thinking about a man who burned investigative documents to protect a mistress who built an entire palace specifically to keep powerful men from plotting against him, and who wept openly at a carriage door at 20 years old, none of that is easy to summarize, but the children, all of them legitimate and otherwise, reveal something about Louis that almost nothing else does. A tenderness so intense it sometimes crossed into judgment-clouding favoritism. A grief so accumulated by the end of his life that it became almost unbearable to read about, and an irony so devastating that it takes your breath away when you fully grasp it. The man who outlived almost everyone. Start with the legitimate ones, because the arithmetic here is already striking. Maria Theresa, the Queen Louis married in 1660, bore him 6 children over the course of their marriage. 6 children, and of those 6 only one survived to adulthood. 1. The others died in infancy or early childhood, Anne Elizabeth at 6 weeks old, Marie Anne at 2 months, a son named Louis-François who died at 5 months. The rhythm of royal childbearing in the 17th century was the rhythm of hope and loss with intervals so short between them that grief barely had time to become itself before it was interrupted by the next pregnancy. Maria Theresa endured this 6 times over. Only the eldest child, the boy who became known as Le Grand Dauphin, survived. Louis had 1 legitimate son. 1. And he spent the next half-century watching that son age and not become king, and then watching his grandchildren age and not become king, and then watching a 2-year-old great-grandson become the only person left standing between the House of Bourbon and the extinction of the dynasty entirely. It is one of the great tragedies of this reign, and it was entirely random. Disease does not negotiate with absolute monarchs. Le Grand Dauphin, Louise's legitimate son, born in 1661, officially named Louis de France, is one of those historical figures who suffers enormously from proximity to his father. Not because Louis was unkind to him, but because Louis by most accounts made decisions about his son's upbringing that reflected the very worst of what well-intentioned parenting looked like in that era. The boy's tutor was a man named the Duc de Montausier, described by contemporaries in terms that leave very little ambiguity. He was harsh, pedantic, and profoundly unpleasant to children. Bishop Bossuet, who had the religious education portfolio, was, according to historical sources, so intellectually overwhelming in his instruction that the young Dauphin developed what one account describes as a lasting horror of books, learning, and history. By the time the boy was 18, he had absorbed almost nothing from the education assembled so expensively for him. He grew up to be a large, affable man who loved hunting, liked lying on a sofa tapping his shoes with a cane, and was genuinely popular with the people of Paris in a way that had almost nothing to do with intellectual engagement and everything to do with an easygoing generosity of spirit that his father had never quite possessed. Louis XIV, who'd been educated through observation and practical immersion by the shrewdest political mind of his generation, had managed to give his own son the worst possible educational experience instead. The irony is not subtle. What complicates this further is that Louis did not dislike his son. By later accounts, he was fond of him in his way. He simply did not involve him in the business of ruling not until it was very late, and even then only partially. Le Grand Dauphin attended council meetings starting at age 40. He was 60 years old when he died of smallpox in April of 1711, having spent his entire adult life in the anteroom of a power he never held. Imagine spending 60 years waiting for a turn that never came. Louis outlived him. Now here is where I need to tell you something about the spring and summer of 1712, because it is the part of this story that I find myself least able to describe without feeling something that I can only call a kind of horrified compassion. By April of 1711, the succession had already taken a blow. The Grand Dauphin was dead. His son, Louis's grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, known as the Petit Dauphin, was now heir. The Duke of Burgundy was by every account a genuinely promising figure. Intelligent, pious, devoted to his wife Marie Adelaide of Savoy, who was one of the few people at the end of the old king's reign who could still make him genuinely laugh. In February of 1712, measles arrived at the court. Marie Adelaide caught it first. She died on the 12th of February, 30 years old. Her husband, the Duke of Burgundy, who had stayed at her side through the whole fatal illness, because he could not bring himself to leave her, caught the disease. He died 6 days later on the 18th of February. He was 29 years old. Their 2 sons were also ill. The elder boy, the Duke of Brittany, 4 years old, the most recent in a line of heirs, died on the 8th of March. In the space of less than a month, Louis XIV had lost his grandson, his beloved granddaughter-in-law, and his great-grandson. The only child left was a 2-year-old boy, the Duke of Anjou. He was alive, but barely, and in the chaos of the outbreak his doctors wanted to bleed him, as doctors bled everyone in that period whether or not it helped, which it rarely did and often made catastrophically worse. His governess refused. The Duchess of Ventadour locked herself in the nursery with the child and 3 nurses and would not let the doctors near him. She simply refused. She held the line, and the 2-year-old lived. He became King of France 3 years later as Louis XV, the oldest living king in Europe, the man who'd been born into a country that called him a miracle, who'd ruled for 72 years, who had outlasted every contemporary, owed the survival of his dynasty to a governess who would not open a door. Stop and think about what Louis was carrying in those final years. I want you to actually try to feel the weight of it, not just list the facts. He had lost his only legitimate son, then his grandson and granddaughter-in-law within days of each other, then his great-grandson. He'd watched in the span of roughly a year the entire direct line of succession essentially collapse, leaving one fragile 2-year-old as the last link in a chain that stretched back centuries. His brother Philippe, whom he had quarrelled with bitterly just before Philippe's sudden death in 1701, was gone. His brother's son, his nephew the Duke of Orléans, was someone Louis deeply distrusted, privately calling him a braggart of crimes, in correspondence because of the man's reputation for libertinism and irreligion. The Versailles that Louis walked through in those final years was full of new faces. The people who had been there at the beginning, who had watched him perform the lever, who had competed for the right to hand him his shirt, who had whispered and angled and plotted and loved him, were mostly dead. The court that had revolved around him like planets around his sun had been repopulated multiple times over by people who only knew the old man, not the young one. Saint-Simon, who had watched all of this, wrote about the end of the reign with what I can only describe as a kind of awed pity. He noted that Louis's grief in this period was profound but characteristically controlled, that the king received even the worst of the 1712 news with the same external composure he'd always maintained going to mass holding council, appearing in public. The Sun King did not collapse. He continued to function, But Maintenon, who was in that room with the door shut in the evenings, who wiped the tears Louis allowed himself only in private, knew what it was costing. And yet here is the thing that has always fascinated me about this story of Louis and his children, and which I think most tellings leave out entirely. He was not only grieving the legitimate ones, the illegitimate children, the ones he had with Louise, with Athenais, with at least one other woman, he had legitimized them, given them titles and estates and marriages into the highest noble families and watched them grow up. He loved them, some of them quite explicitly. His favourite child, by his own apparent reckoning, was the Duke of Maine, Louis-Auguste Athénaïs' eldest surviving son, born in 1670, and raised initially by Maintenon. The boy had a limp, a clever mind, and a position at his father's court that reflected genuine affection as much as political calculation. Louis legitimized his children and then kept pushing. In July of 1714, under pressure from Maintenon, he elevated the Duke of Maine and his brother, the Count of Toulouse, to the rank of princes of the blood, meaning they were officially in the line of succession to the French throne. After all legitimate lines, yes, but there. The ancient nobility of France was appalled. Saint Simon, who was himself of old noble blood, and felt these things viscerally, wrote about this decision with undisguised fury. He had always referred to the legitimized children simply as the bastards, a word he deployed with the precision of a weapon, and the idea that these children should take precedence over ancient houses in the order of succession was to him, and many like him, an affront to everything that the French aristocracy stood for. Louis did it anyway, because they were his children, and he was running out of legitimate ones to put in their place. What does it mean, do you think, to be a parent in the way Louis XIV was a parent? Not in the warm, modern, hands-on sense. Louis XIV was not going to be found helping with homework or attending a school play, but in a different, perhaps more complicated sense of using every instrument of power available to you to secure a future for children born into circumstances not entirely of your or their choosing. The legitimized children resented in many cases the awkwardness of their position. They outranked most of the nobility, which the nobility never forgave. They were not quite royals, not quite nobles, not quite anything the existing social categories easily accommodated. The daughter who married Louis's nephew, the future Duchess of Orleans, was called Madame Lucifer, by her own husband's circle, apparently without her minding too much. The marriages Louis arranged for them were sometimes unhappy. Several of the legitimized children's own lives were complicated by the extraordinary circumstances of their births in ways that money and titles could not entirely smooth over. And then there was Louis de Bourbon, the Count of Vermandois. Louise de la Valliere's surviving son, born in 1667, made an Admiral of France at the age of 2. He died at 16 on his first military campaign. We talked about this in Louise's chapter. But what I did not mention then is what happened at Versailles when the news arrived. The king received it. He did not weep publicly. He composed his face and continued. And that composure in that moment tells you something more painful than grief would have. This was a man who had practiced not showing grief for so long, in so many circumstances for so many different people, that the mechanism had become almost involuntary. He felt things. The private record makes clear that he felt things deeply, but the performance of steadiness had fused so completely with the actual self that even the death of a 16-year-old son could not break through the surface in front of witnesses. By the time of the final years, the years after 1712, with the dynasty contracted to one small child, and the wars going badly and the finances of France in serious trouble from decades of expensive conflict, Louis was something that people rarely consider when they think of the Sun King. He was old, he was tired, he was grieving on a scale that most people never experience, and he was still performing. Every morning the lever, every afternoon the council, every evening to Maintenon's apartments where the door shut, and the performance finally briefly stopped. He wrote in private correspondence toward the end of his life that he had sometimes made mistakes, not through lack of will, but through insufficient wisdom about which battles truly mattered. For a man who had spent 72 years convinced of his own divine sanction, that is a startling admission. It is the kind of thing you say when you have watched enough funerals to understand at last the limits of what any person, even the most absolute ruler in the history of Europe, can actually control. This accumulation of loss is the context for the last chapter of Louis's life, the one that involves not a woman or a war or a palace, but something much stranger and more revealing: his body. Because Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who had weaponized his own physical presence into an instrument of political domination for 7 decades, was also a man who spent those same 7 decades engaged in a medical relationship with his physicians that was by any measure absolutely extraordinary. The things that were done to that royal body, the things that body endured, and what it says ultimately about the man behind the golden surface, that is where we are headed next. Somewhere around the year 1685, the most powerful man in France developed a problem that he could neither delegate nor ceremonialize away. He developed a problem with his bottom. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking we just spent the better part of several hours discussing one of the most magnificent reigns in European history, the loves and losses and secrets of the Sun King, and now we are talking about this. And yes, we are. Because this particular episode in Louis XIV's medical history is one of the most genuinely extraordinary things that happened during his entire reign, and because it reveals in a way that nothing else quite does, what it actually meant to inhabit the body of an absolute monarch in the 17th century. It also accidentally changed the history of surgery, so bear with me. Let us start a bit further back, because the anal fistula of 1685 does not happen in isolation. It happens at the end of a long, meticulously documented, utterly relentless campaign that Louis's physicians have been conducting against his body for decades. The document is called the Journal de la Santé du Roi, the Journal of the King's Health. It was maintained by royal physicians throughout Louis's reign and recorded in careful clinical detail every cough, every fever, every bowel movement, every medical intervention that this king experienced from the mid-17th century onward. If you sit down with this document, which historians have at length, you discover that the medical reality of being Louis XIV was significantly less glamorous than the portraits suggest. He had recurring fevers, periods of deafness, what may have been bouts of malaria, a serious typhoid episode in his youth that nearly killed him, gout that worsened progressively as he aged, rheumatism, multiple infestations of intestinal parasites, a fall from a horse at 45 that dislocated his shoulder, and running through all of it like a bass note in a piece of music, you eventually stop consciously hearing the treatments. 17th century medicine operated on the theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine, by way of the medieval period refined by no one and improved upon very little, that the body maintained health through a balance of 4 humours, and that sickness was the result of imbalance. The correct response to imbalance was removal. Blood was removed through bleeding using lancets or leeches. Excess humours were removed through purging laxatives, emetics, substances that produced elimination at either end. And this is the part that belongs specifically to Louis. The intestinal tract was regularly cleaned through the administration of enemas. Regularly. According to the Journal of the King's Health, Louis XIV received approximately 2,000 enemas over the course of his lifetime. 2,000. The court physicians recorded some periods during which this happened 3 or even 4 times in a single day. It became so embedded in royal routine that the equipment was personalized, specialized syringes made of fine materials, the fluid sometimes perfumed with rose or orange blossom, because if you're going to subject a king to this particular indignity, you might as well make it smell pleasant. The courtiers with the magnificent logic of Versailles decided this was fashionable. Aristocrats began acquiring their own personalized enema syringes. Ivory was popular. Silver was for the particularly self-important. This is the 17th century at its most revealing. A medical procedure of dubious therapeutic value became a status symbol because the king had it done. I find this both deeply funny and oddly moving. Now, to the teeth. Louis XIV was in a small biological footnote to his life, born with 2 teeth already in his mouth, a phenomenon that apparently occurs in roughly 1 infant out of every 2,000. Whether this was considered auspicious or alarming at the time I cannot say, but it sets up the dental section of his medical history with a certain dramatic irony, because by the time Louis was in his 40s, he had essentially no teeth at all. The cause was partly the era 17th century dentistry was, not to put it gently, what anyone would call reliable. Partly it was Louis's well-known fondness for sugared fruits and sweetmeats, which were consumed with the same enthusiasm he applied to most pleasures. And partly it was the well-documented fact that the royal surgeon initially refused to pull certain teeth because dentistry was considered a mechanical and therefore slightly undignified trade, leaving infected teeth in place longer than they should have been. The decision to eventually remove all remaining teeth was made after an infection spread through his jaw. The procedure was by any account excruciating, performed without anesthetic by torchlight with instruments that would make a modern dentist visibly upset. And during one of these extractions something went wrong. The surgeon, pulling too enthusiastically, removed not just the tooth, but a significant piece of the king's jaw and palate. This left a hole in the roof of Louis's mouth, an open connection between his oral cavity and his nasal passage. What this meant in practice was that whenever Louis drank anything, any wine, any soup, any liquid at all, it came out of his nose, openly, in front of people, at formal dinners, at council meetings, in the presence of foreign ambassadors. A surgeon eventually attempted to cauterize the fistula with partial success, and the passage was ultimately reduced if not entirely closed. But for a period of time the most magnificently powerful man in Europe had a king-sized leak in his face, and the breath. The bad breath which Athénaïs de Montespan had famously lathered herself in perfume to disguise apparently originated partly in the decomposing food that accumulated in the palatal damage trapped unreachable rotting. The Russian ambassador to the French court, a man named Yakov Dolgorukov, left a diplomatic assessment of Louis XIV for the historical record. It read in full, "Smells like an animal." Not exactly what you hope to achieve when you are the Sun King. All of which brings us in November of 1686 to the operation. The fistula, an anal fistula, which is what happens when an abscess forms near the rectum and goes untreated long enough to create an abnormal channel, had been developing since early 1685. The January entry in the Journal of the King's Health, read with all the clinical precision of men trying very hard not to panic. His Majesty today complained of a small tumour towards the perineum approximately 2 finger breadths from the anus. Over the following months, an abscess, a fistula, attempts to treat it with enemas, poultices of barley and beans and flaxseed boiled in vinegar, warm compresses, and eventually a red-hot iron applied directly to the area, which sounds and presumably felt exactly as bad as it sounds. Nothing worked. The king could not ride a horse, could not sit comfortably on the throne or anywhere, could not carry out the physical routines of his daily life without significant pain. The physicians, who were deeply reluctant to recommend surgical intervention, because cutting the body was beneath their professional dignity, eventually ran out of alternatives. Surgery it had to be. But none of the royal physicians performed surgery themselves. That was a different trade, entirely the province of barber surgeons, men who worked with their hands rather than their philosophies. Enter Charles-François Félix. Now I want you to imagine the position of Monsieur Félix for a moment, because it is extraordinary. He was a barber surgeon. He had some experience with fistulas in general. He had no experience with fistulas of this specific type in this specific location. He was being asked to operate on the King of France, with no anaesthetic, by candlelight or torchlight, in front of an audience. He asked for 6 months to prepare. This was granted. What Félix did with those 6 months is the part of this story that I find simultaneously admirable and somewhat disturbing. He went out into the hospital of Paris and the countryside and recruited approximately 75 patients. Some accounts say men from the prisons, others say from the general population of poor people who needed the operation and had no means to refuse royal patronage, and he practiced. He operated on 75 people to prepare for operating on one. The bodies one account records with a kind of calm brutality were buried in the early mornings, while Paris was still asleep so that no one knew what was happening. He also used those 6 months to design a new surgical instrument, a curved scalpel specifically made for this procedure, which he named the bistouri royal, the royal lancet. These instruments still exist. You can see them at Versailles today. On the 18th of November 1686 at 7 o'clock in the morning in the king's bedchamber, the procedure was performed. Present Madame de Maintenon, the Grand Dauphin, the Minister of War, the king's confessor, the royal physicians, and Monsieur Félix presumably in a state that can only be described as controlled terror. The operation lasted 3 hours, without anaesthetic. Laid across the edge of his bed, the Sun King, the most ceremonially protected and publicly observed person in France, endured 3 hours of a surgical procedure that must have been unlike anything his carefully maintained public composure had ever been asked to handle. Contemporary witnesses recorded that he bore the pain as steadfastly as is possible. Near the end, unable to contain himself entirely, Louis turned to Félix and spoke the sentence that historians have quoted ever since. He said, "Is it done, gentlemen? Finish. Do not treat me as a king. I want to heal as if I were a peasant. Do not treat me as a king. I want to heal as if I were a peasant." Take a moment with that sentence. This is the man who had weaponized kingship as no one before him, who had turned the act of waking up into a ceremony, who had made the act of dressing into a political ritual, who had spent 72 years ensuring that every room he entered, every hall he walked through, every person he addressed knew exactly what he was. And lying on the edge of his bed in agony, he asked for the one thing all that power could never actually buy: to be treated like a normal person, to be allowed to hurt without the hurt meaning something political, to heal without an audience. He never quite got that. The getting up ceremony was only slightly delayed on the day of the operation. By that afternoon he was presiding over a council meeting from his bed as usual. The show went on. The aftermath has a quality to it that, given everything we know about Versailles and its social ecosystems, is absolutely perfect. Félix recovered from his trauma, received a large sum of money and estate, and a title of nobility, and apparently never picked up a scalpel again. He had done the one thing he needed to do. He was done. The courtiers of Versailles, meanwhile, decided that fistulas were fashionable. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal thing that happened. Having a fistula, or more precisely having had the operation, became something to brag about. Some courtiers apparently reported fistula symptoms they did not have. A number of them asked Félix to perform the same surgery on them electively. He told them they did not need it. They were, by one contemporary account, greatly disappointed. At least 30 people at the court of Versailles requested voluntary anal surgery because the king had had it. Fashion has rarely descended to quite this level of literalism. There was also the matter of the song. Maintenon, wanting to support Louis through the operation, had commissioned a short hymn for the students of Saint-Cyr to sing while the procedure was underway. The text began with the words that can be roughly translated as, "God save the King." The tune adapted over the following decades travelled to England, where it became eventually a rather famous anthem. Do you want to know what I find most remarkable about all of this? Not the enemas, though. 2000 is genuinely extraordinary. Not the dental disasters, though the image of wine coming out of the king's nose at a state dinner is not easily displaced from the imagination. Not even the fistula surgery, as pivotal as it turned out to be. What I find most remarkable is that almost none of this was private. The journal of the king's health was circulated throughout the court. Every illness, every treatment, every enema was recorded and discussed. The morning ceremony included a visit from the royal physicians before any courtiers entered, which means that every day Louis submitted to medical examination in front of an audience. His body was documented with the same thoroughness as his military campaigns or his building projects. In a way, the body of Louis XIV was not his own. It belonged to France. It was a piece of state infrastructure subject to the same scrutiny and maintenance as any road or fortification. The man inside it was in this respect, as in so many others, required to live as public property. He endured this with characteristic composure. He did not rage against it as far as we know. He understood that the king's body was not the same thing as the person's body, and he accepted the terms of that arrangement. But I go back always to that sentence from the operating table, "Do not treat me as a king." He said it in pain, and he probably meant it only pragmatically. He wanted the surgeon to work efficiently, not defer to him ceremonially in the middle of a procedure. But I cannot help reading it as something more, as the one moment in 72 years of relentless performance, when the man underneath everything surfaced just long enough to say what he actually wanted. He wanted to be a peasant. He wanted to be uncomplicated. He wanted to hurt without an audience. He could not have that. He was the Sun King. The sun does not take a day off. But the body does eventually insist on being heard. And in the final years of Louis's reign, after all the grief and all the losses we've been through, the body of the Sun King began to speak with a clarity that no ceremony could contain. The story of how Louis XIV died, the gangrene, the weeks of public dying, the words he said to his young great-grandson who would become the next king, is the chapter where everything in this long, brilliant, complicated life arrives at its reckoning. That is where we are headed now. August of 1715. Louis XIV is 76 years old. He returns from a hunting trip at Mali, still hunting at 76 because the man has never learned to stop doing what he's always done and his leg hurts. His physician, a man named Fagon, decides it is sciatica. He prescribes a purgative. The leg continues to hurt. A few days later, a red spot appears on the skin. The surgeon looks at it and understands immediately what the physician has not yet said aloud. This is not sciatica. This is gangrene. There is a particular quality to the final weeks of Louis XIV's life that I want to try to capture, because most history books compress it into a few sentences between the great events of the reign and the death announcement, and in doing so they lose something essential. They lose the fact that Louis, even dying, performed, even with his leg turning black, even with pain so severe he could not walk to Maintenon's apartments, the walk he had made every single evening for decades, the walk that had become as much a part of his life as breathing. Even as gangrene spread from his calf toward his knee and then beyond, while his physicians stood around him applying poultices and ass's milk, and whatever else the medicine of 1715 had to offer, which was almost nothing useful, he held council meetings from his bed. The getting up ceremony continued, modified slightly for the bedridden state, but continued. He carried on with his duty to the end, because he was the Sun King, and the sun does not go dark. The surgeons told him at some point that amputation might save his life. He refused. Whether this was courage or despair or simply the considered judgment of a 76-year-old man who had buried his son and grandson and great-grandson and decided that whatever came next was acceptable, I do not know. Probably all three. But he refused the amputation, and the gangrene continued its slow, inexorable progress up his leg, and the court of Versailles gathered in the corridors and the antechambers and did what the court of Versailles had always done. It watched the king. On the 25th of August, the feast day of St. Louis, his patron Louis was finally confined to his bed and did not leave it again. He asked for his 5-year-old great-grandson to be brought to him. This is the moment I want to sit with for a while, because it is one of the most quietly devastating in this entire story. The child brought into that bedchamber was Louis, the Duke of Anjou, the boy who would become Louis XV. He was 5 years old. He had survived the measles outbreak of 1712 because a governess had locked a door and refused to let the doctors in. He was quite literally the last person standing between the House of Bourbon and the end of everything Louis XIV had built. A 5-year-old. The old king in the bed, 76 years old, his leg turned by disease, his face bearing every year of the longest reign in European history, looked at this child and said something that historians have been quoting ever since, because it contains in a very few sentences the full reckoning of a man who had spent his life believing in something that reality had spent the last 20 years slowly disproving. He told the boy to love peace. He said that he himself had loved war too much, those were his exact words as recorded by those present, and that war was the ruin of the people. He told him not to imitate his taste for great building projects. He told him to think of his people's suffering, to spend what might be spent on alleviating that suffering rather than on the monuments of a royal ego. He told him to be a peaceful prince. He said, "Try to remain at peace with your neighbours. It is what I most desired, but which I could not always achieve." Do you understand how much it means for this man to say this? Louis XIV, who had waged 5 major wars over the course of his reign, who had annexed territories and fought alliances and spent France very nearly to financial ruin, in pursuit of glory on the battlefield, told a 5-year-old child that war is the ruin of the people. This was not false modesty. It was not a performance for the court. It was the honest accounting of a man who had spent decades watching his wars kill hundreds of thousands of people, drain the treasury, cause 2 famines that killed more than 2 million French citizens between 1693 and 1710, and leave the country he had built to such magnificence in a state of exhaustion and debt from which it would not fully recover. He knew what he had done. He had known for a long time. And here, finally, in front of a 5-year-old who could not yet understand what he was being told, Louis XIV said it out loud. What happened in the final days was, by the accounts we have, deeply human in ways that the great king usually never permitted himself. He said goodbye to his court, twice called them in, spoke to them, and then had to call them in again, because he had not yet died when expected. And there was some awkwardness about whether the farewell had been used up. He said goodbye to Maintenon 3 times. There was a man named Brune who arrived claiming to have a miraculous cure. The court, in whatever combination of desperation and hope that late-stage medical crisis produces, allowed Brune into the royal bedchamber. Louis apparently felt somewhat better after Brune's treatment, which involved rubbing the leg with some preparation Brune had brought. The improvement was temporary, and the gangrene was not actually impressed. By the 30th of August, Louis was drifting in and out of consciousness. On the morning of September the 1st, 1715, at 8:15, the Sun King died. He was 76 years old. He had reigned for 72 years, and 110 days the longest reign of any sovereign monarch in recorded history. He had been born in 1638 to parents who had been married for 23 years without an heir, and considered his birth a miracle. He had spent 40 years being waited on by a court that watched him dress and eat and pray and govern and come to bed. He had loved a woman he could not marry, married a woman he did not love, loved several others with varying degrees of consequence, and at the end been loved by a woman born in a prison who outlived him by 4 years. His body was autopsied the following day on the state dining table. The gangrene was found to have spread extensively through the left side. The heart was described as being in very good condition. The brain was found to be sound and in natural condition. The heart of the Sun King intact. The brain of the Sun King sound. Everything else worn down and used up and surrendered at last to time. Now, I want to take a step back from the death scene and talk about something that the end of Louis's life makes impossible to avoid anymore. The question of what exactly Versailles was for, and what it cost. Because here is the paradox at the heart of this entire story. Louis XIV built the most magnificent physical monument to power in Western history. He built a system so elegant, so total, so brilliantly designed that it ran essentially without friction for over 50 years. He imposed a kind of order on France, on its nobles, its bureaucracy, its culture, its self-image, that no European monarch before or after quite matched. And then he died, leaving France nearly bankrupt its treasury, strained to breaking by decades of expensive war, its tax system so weighted against the poor that the burden fell almost entirely on the peasants and the common people who could least afford it, while the nobility kept so beautifully occupied at Versailles, competing for the honour of handing the king his shirt, remained exempt from most direct taxation by an arrangement so ancient and entrenched that no one quite dared to end it. The things Louis built were real. The arts he patronised were real, the military achievements were real, the administrative reforms were real. France in 1715 was in many ways a far more organised, culturally significant, internationally respected country than it had been in 1643 when a 4-year-old boy inherited a throne. But 2 million people had died in famines while the palace fountains ran. And the system that Louis had built was in a fundamental sense incapable of reforming itself because it depended at its core on the personal authority and infinite attention of a single extraordinary individual. When that individual was gone, what remained was the structure without the structural engineer. The aristocrats who'd been tamed at Versailles by proximity and ceremony, and the ever-present awareness that the king was watching, eventually stopped being watched. Their resentments accumulated. The tax burden on the poor did not lift. The financial problems compounded. The Enlightenment ideas that were already circulating about reason, about natural rights, about the legitimacy of monarchs who governed badly, found an audience that grew larger with every generation. 74 years after Louis XIV died, his great-great-grandson Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette lost their heads to the guillotine. The revolution that followed did not come from nowhere. It came at least in part from everything Louis had built the system that worked brilliantly for as long as a Sun King was available to run it, and then began slowly, inevitably to collapse under its own weight. This is the ultimate paradox of Versailles. It was both the greatest achievement of its century and the slow-burning cause of one of the most violent upheavals in European history. Historians have argued about how much responsibility to assign Louis XIV for what eventually happened to France. It is not a simple question. He did not cause the revolution. He could not have foreseen it. He was born into an absolute monarchy and built it into the most advanced version of itself that the world had yet seen. He used the tools available to him with extraordinary skill, but on his deathbed, telling a 5-year-old not to love war and not to spend extravagantly, he knew something was wrong. He had felt it in the accumulated debts, and the soldiers who died in his campaigns, and the peasants who starved in his famines. He had felt it perhaps in the moments when Maintenant your solidity looked at him with an honesty no one else at Versailles was permitted to offer, and said things quietly that no one else said at all. He was not, when all the ceremony was stripped away, a simple man. He was a man who'd been asked to be something inhuman from the moment of his birth, who'd performed that something with almost supernatural consistency for over 7 decades, and who used the small private hours, the door shut, the candle low, the face finally still to be whatever was left underneath. Saint-Simon, who watched all of it and wrote about it with the precision of someone who understood he was recording history in real time, left one of the most honest assessments of Louis that exists. He said in so many words that the king was a man capable of more than his circumstances allowed him to show, that the greatness was real, but so was the human cost of maintaining it. One last thing. There is a famous portrait of Louis XIV painted by Hyacinthe Rigaud in 1701 that you have almost certainly seen, even if you don't know the painter's name. It is the one with the ermine-lined robe and the crown and the sceptre, and the extraordinary high-heeled shoes, and Louis standing in a pose so commanding it practically vibrates off the canvas with controlled authority. What most people don't notice when they look at this portrait, or what they notice but don't quite register, is the face. The face is tired. It is magnificent, yes. The posture is immaculate. The hand holds the sceptre as if it were a natural extension of the arm. But the eyes, if you look at them carefully, carry something that the costume and the setting and the extraordinary production values of the painting cannot quite hide. This is the portrait of a man who's been performing for 60 years and knows exactly how many more years of performance remain. He was 63 when it was painted. He would live 14 more years. He would lose his son, his grandson, his granddaughter-in-law, his great-grandson before he was done. He would watch Versailles empty of the people who had defined it for him. He would sit in Maintenon's apartment in the evenings and be briefly just a person. The portrait does not show any of that. It is not supposed to. The portrait is the Sun King. The man is something else, something private and complicated and ultimately unknowable, as all people are ultimately unknowable. That gap between the portrait and the person is the story we have been telling, and yet we're not quite done. Because Louis XIV's legacy did not end with his death, or with Versailles, or even with the revolution that his system helped to make possible. His influence on architecture, on statecraft, on the very idea of what a modern nation could look like rippled outward for centuries. And the women who shaped him, the children who came from him, the court that orbited him, the system that outlasted him, all had their own final chapters. So did Versailles itself, that golden cage that housed a civilization for decades and then became a symbol of something else entirely. That is the story of what he left behind, and that is exactly where we are going next. 74 years. That is the gap between the death of Louis XIV and the moment that a crowd of Parisian market women, hungry, furious, carrying weapons seized from the city's armory, marched 12 miles to the palace he built and demanded that the king come out. 74 years between the Sun King and the revolution that dismantled everything he had constructed. Not a long time in the history of civilizations, and yet long enough that the connection gets lost, that we talk about Versailles as one story, and the French Revolution as a separate story, when in truth they are the same story told across 2 generations. What happened in October of 1789 was at least in part the bill coming due for what happened in 1682. Let us step back for a moment, not to the death scene which we have already been through, but to Versailles itself, to what it actually was structurally and politically, and what that structure left behind. When Louis XIV moved the court permanently to Versailles in 1682, he was not simply relocating a government. He was constructing a system. The palace and its elaborate daily rituals were not decoration for power, they were the mechanism of power. Every ceremony, every etiquette rule, every carefully calibrated hierarchy of who could sit in whose presence, who could hand the king his shirt, who could speak to him in passing, who had an apartment on which floor, and how far from the royal apartments, all of it was designed with one purpose: to keep the most dangerous people in France close enough to be watched and busy enough not to cause trouble. It worked brilliantly for as long as Louis lived to run it. The great nobles of France, the men and women whose ancestors had led armies, governed provinces, and challenged the crown itself during the Fronde, were persuaded over decades of carefully engineered social pressure to become courtiers instead, to compete for places at Versailles instead of governing their estates, to spend their fortunes on clothes and carriages and the endless expensive performance of elegance, rather than on building private power bases in the provinces. One nobleman recorded in contemporary documents described the situation with a phrase that cuts right to the heart of it. A nobleman who lives at home on his estate, he wrote, lives free but without substance. A nobleman at Versailles lives with substance but without freedom. That bargain substance for freedom, proximity for power, was the engine of the Versailles system. And it worked, until it didn't. Because here is what Louis's system could not solve, and what his long reign made progressively worse: the money. The palace itself had cost by most estimates somewhere between $200 and $300 billion in modern terms. The wars, and Louis fought 5 significant wars over his reign, pursuing territorial ambitions that consumed enormous resources, cost far more. France, to fund all of this, taxed, and taxed, and taxed. But there was an old arrangement embedded in the foundations of French society that no king had yet found the political will to dismantle. The nobility did not pay direct taxes. The burden fell instead on the peasants and the common people, the people who had the least and were asked to bear the most. Louis knew this was unstable. His minister Colbert, the financial genius who turned a 1661 deficit into a surplus by 1666, had worked on the problem throughout his career. But the structural reform that would have required taxing the nobility too politically costly, too likely to trigger exactly the kind of aristocratic resistance that Versailles had been designed to prevent. So the debt accumulated, the wars added to it. The famines of the 1690s and the 1700s killed 2 million people and generated social misery on a scale that no amount of court ceremony could conceal from the countryside. And Louis died, leaving a 5-year-old great-grandson on the throne of a country that was in financial terms significantly more fragile than it had been 72 years earlier when he inherited it. Now his successors, Louis XV and then Louis XVI, tried to manage the inheritance. Louis XV reigned for nearly as long as his great-grandfather, from 1715 until 1774, and maintained a version of the Versailles system, though with less of the personal authority and attention that had made it function under Louis XIV. The court continued, the ceremonies continued, the debt continued. Louis XVI, who inherited in 1774, was not a bad man by the accounts we have. He was thoughtful, genuinely interested in reform, uncomfortable with the excesses of the system he had inherited. But he was attempting to reform an absolute monarchy from within, without the tools to do it, while the Enlightenment ideas that had been fermenting for decades reached their public tipping point, and an economic crisis made bread too expensive for the poor to buy. On the 5th of October 1789, 74 years after the Sun King's death, 6,000 women from the markets of Paris marched to Versailles. They were hungry. They wanted bread. They were also by this point beyond hunger. They were angry about everything that the palace represented, the privilege, the exemption from consequence, the visible obscenity of a court that still performed elaborate ceremonies in gilded rooms, while people starved outside its walls. They breached the gate. They surged through the corridors. Some of them in the early hours of the 6th of October found their way into the royal apartments, into the rooms where Marie Antoinette barely escaped through the labyrinthine back passages of the palace. By the afternoon of October the 6th, Louis XVI and his family were in a carriage heading to Paris. The crowd cheered sarcastically that they were bringing the baker's wife, and the baker's lad to Paris. The royal family never returned to Versailles. What happened to the palace after that is in its own way one of the more interesting aspects of this whole story. It was not destroyed. That matters. The Bastille was torn down stone by stone almost immediately after its fall. Symbols of the Ancien Regime were demolished or defaced across France. But Versailles survived. The furniture was stripped, sold at auction, distributed to museums and private buyers in a series of sales that dispersed more than 17,000 lots in the summer of 1793. The animals from the royal menagerie were transferred to what would become the Paris Natural History Museum. The royal libraries were redistributed to public institutions, but the palace itself stood. Its architecture was too large to destroy and too beautiful not to preserve. By 1793, the convention had declared it a public repository. Plans emerged for a museum. The building that had been designed as the ultimate expression of one man's absolute power gradually became paradoxically a monument available to anyone who wanted to walk through its doors. Louis XIV, who had used proximity to himself as the supreme currency of his court, would have found it difficult to imagine a future in which millions of strangers paid admission to walk through his gilded rooms and photograph his bed. I find myself wondering what he would have made of all of this, the revolution, the museum, the tourists. And then I stop because the question is slightly unfair. Louis was not an oracle. He was a very intelligent man who operated with the tools and knowledge of his era, and he used those tools with extraordinary skill. But there is a line of thinking that follows directly from his reign to what eventually followed it, and it goes like this. The very success of Versailles created the conditions for its destruction. By taming the nobility, by making their survival dependent on royal favour, rather than local power, Louis had removed from French society the one class that had historically served as a buffer between the monarchy and revolutionary pressure from below. The old nobility hobbled at Versailles had been replaced in the provinces by an increasingly prosperous and educated middle class, the bourgeoisie, who read Voltaire and Rousseau and had serious questions about the divine right of kings. The peasants bearing the tax burden that the nobility had been exempted from were one bad harvest away from starvation, and the court, the great machine that Louis had built to centralize and control, continued running on ceremony and etiquette, long after the person capable of giving that ceremony its meaning was gone. When Marie Antoinette performed the elaborate public rituals of getting dressed each morning at Versailles, handing her chemise down a chain of ladies-in-waiting according to rank, standing in drafts while the protocol of priority was observed, she was performing a ceremony that had been designed to make people feel close to Louis XIV. By her time it had become an absurdity, an empty theatre where the audience had long since stopped believing in the play. The people understood this. That is in part why they marched. Here is what I want you to take away from this part of the story, because I think it gets lost in the big dramatic sweep of revolutionary history. Versailles was not just a palace. It was an argument. Louis XIV's argument went like this. All power flows from me. All beauty, all culture, all civilization, it comes through me, from me, because of me. The sun rises and everything orbits around it. This is not arrogance, but theology. God made it so. For a lifetime, that argument worked. The court accepted it. Europe accepted it. Other monarchs copied Versailles because they wanted to make the same argument in their own countries. Peter the Great at Peterhof, which he built after visiting France and being dazzled by what Louis had created. The Habsburgs at Schönbrunn in Vienna, Frederick the Great at Sanssouci in Prussia. Palace after palace across Europe, each one a version of the same claim power has a face, and that face is beautiful. and this building is its body. But arguments eventually require evidence, and by the time Louis's great-great-grandson sat on the throne, the evidence was pointing the wrong direction. The wars had not made France permanently dominant, they had made her exhausted. The taxation that funded Versailles had not elevated France, it had crushed the people who paid it. The Edict of Fontainebleau, which Louis had signed with Maintenon's blessing, had driven 200,000 skilled Protestant workers and craftspeople out of France, taking their knowledge and capital to England and Prussia and the Netherlands, where they helped build the economies that would eventually rival and surpass France. The argument, in other words, has been falsified by the facts. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Is there a version of the Louis XIV story that ends differently? If he had taxed the nobility, actually reformed the tax structure as his ministers repeatedly suggested, and his successors half-heartedly attempted, would the revolution have been avoided? If he had been more sparing in his wars, as he himself admitted on his deathbed he should have been, would France have been in a better position to absorb the social changes that Enlightenment thinking was bringing? The honest answer is probably not entirely. The forces that produced the French Revolution were larger than any one reign, or even any one century. But the specific shape of the revolution, the particular fury of it, the way it targeted the symbols of royal privilege with such precise anger, that was very much Louis XIV's legacy. The people marching on Versailles in 1789 knew exactly what they were marching on. They'd been told for a century and more that Versailles was the centre of everything. They believed it. That is why they went there first. The Sun King had succeeded so completely in making his palace the symbol of French power that when French power became intolerable, it was the palace that paid. And then there is the other side of the legacy, which is equally real and equally significant. During the reign of Louis XIV, France became undeniably and durably the cultural centre of Europe. This is not a small thing. The French language under his patronage and through the work of the Académie Française, the institution he sponsored that standardized and elevated French as a literary language, became the lingua franca of European diplomacy. The Treaty of Rastatt in 1713 and 1714, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, was the first major European treaty to be written in French rather than Latin. From that moment until well into the 20th century, French was the default language of international diplomacy and educated conversation across the continent. Every serious European monarch and many beyond Europe wanted their children to speak French, wanted French tutors, wanted French fashions, French furniture, French cuisine, French theatre. The cultural prestige that Louis had cultivated so deliberately radiated outward for generations in ways that no amount of military reverse could fully undo. He patronized Molière the playwright, whose comedies still play in theatres today. He employed Lully, whose music shaped the development of European opera. He brought André Le Nôtre to design the gardens of Versailles, and the principles Le Nôtre established the formal garden. The controlled perspective, the assertion of human order over natural chaos, influenced garden design from London to St. Petersburg to the estates of American founding fathers. The Baroque painter Charles Le Brun, the sculptor Girardon, the architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart, these men produced work under Louis's patronage that defined what European aristocratic art looked like for a century. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, which Louis had built to celebrate his military victories over the Dutch, is still one of the most visited rooms in the world. 12 million people walk through it annually. The Sun King wanted to be remembered. In this at least he succeeded beyond any reasonable measure. What does it mean, all of this together? The magnificence and the violence and the women marching, and the court that became a museum, and the language that outlasted the monarchy, and the palace that outlasted the language. I have been thinking about that for the entire time we have been telling this story, and I think what it means is something like this. Louis XIV was a person who was asked from before his birth to be something more than a person. He was given a role so large that it required a palace the size of a small city to contain it. He performed that role with a discipline and a consistency and a genuine brilliance that no one before or after quite matched. He was by any measure one of the most consequential human beings in European history, but he was also, and this is the thing that the gilded rooms and the official portraits and the name Sun King can make us forget just a person. A man who cried at a carriage door once and never fully recovered from what that meant, who loved a woman named Marie and was not allowed to keep her, who had a secret wife he never publicly acknowledged, who told a 5-year-old not to love war because he knew at the end of everything that he had loved it too much. The gap between the portrait and the person. That gap is the most human thing about him, but we are still not quite at the end of this story. Because if Louis XIV was the portrait and the person behind the portrait was what we have been describing all this time, there is one more question worth sitting with before we draw the curtain. What did the people who actually loved him, not the courtiers who competed for his favour, but the people who were quietly, genuinely present for the private man, what did they actually think of him in the fullness of what they knew? Saint-Simon spent decades watching Louis and wrote about him with a ferocity and an honesty that the Sun King himself never saw. Maintenon sat with him every evening for 32 years and left behind letters that historians have spent centuries parsing for what they actually reveal. And Marie Mancini, who had known him when he was still capable of falling to his knees for love, wrote her own memoir published under her own name, and lived to see the year in which he died. Their testimony and what it tells us about the real private life of the Sun King is where we are going next. There was a man at Versailles who spent 30 years watching the Sun King, not as a loyal servant, not as an admirer, and certainly not as the kind of courtier who competed for the honour of handing over a shirt every morning. This man watched Louis XIV the way a naturalist watches an animal in the wild with fascination, with a certain cold precision, and with the private conviction that he was recording something the world needed to know, even if the subject himself would have burned every page on sight. His name was Louis de Rouvroy, the Duc de Saint-Simon. He was short, self-important, possessed of what contemporaries described as small but perpetually watchful eyes, and he kept notes on everything about everyone every day that he then locked away and did not show a living soul. He began writing in 1694 when he was 19 years old. He died in 1755 at the age of 80. When his manuscript was finally released from government archives confiscated after his death by a minister who feared what they contained, they sat sealed for 60 years before anyone could read them. The world discovered that what this irritable, brilliant, furiously opinionated man had been doing all those decades was producing what Chateaubriand would later call with characteristic French hyperbole and considerable accuracy a work that had been written like the devil for posterity, 2,300 pages in folio, in his own hand barely a correction on a single page. And what those pages reveal about Louis XIV when you read them carefully is something that no official portrait, no state ceremony, no golden room at Versailles was ever designed to show. Saint-Simon did not like Louis XIV. Let me be honest about that because it matters for how you read his testimony. He was a man of old aristocratic blood who found the elevation of illegitimate children, the reduction of the ancient nobility to servants of ceremony, and the general theatrical machinery of Versailles, a sustained offence against everything he believed a proper monarchy should be. His judgments on Louis are often harsh, sometimes unfair, occasionally driven by personal grudges that he does not quite bother to conceal. And yet, the Louis that emerges from Saint-Simon's pages is the most fully rendered portrait we have, because Saint-Simon was there. He was present for the daily routines, the small moments, the unguarded expressions. He recorded what Louis ate and how he walked, and what he said when he was tired. He described the king's face in grief and in pleasure with equal attention. And for all his biases, he was too good a writer and too accurate an observer to simply invent what was not there. Here is what he wrote about Louis's natural intelligence, which he was quick to note was below mediocrity, in raw terms meaning Louis was not a man of exceptional intellectual gifts. But then he added something that I think is more interesting, that Louis had a mind capable of improvement, of receiving polish, of assimilating what was best in the minds of others without slavish imitation. He profited throughout his life from having associated with the ablest and wittiest persons. That is a remarkably precise and honest assessment. And it matches what we know from the historical record. Louis was not a genius in the way that, say, Frederick the Great was a genius, or in the way that some of his own ministers were geniuses. What he was a man of extraordinary judgment and extraordinary discipline, who surrounded himself with the best available minds and absorbed them without losing himself in the process. That is actually rarer than genius. Saint-Simon also wrote in a passage that stayed with me for a long time, "Others were not allowed to dream as he had lived." Read that twice. Others were not allowed to dream as he had lived. What he means is that the life Louis inhabited, the splendor, the power, the gilded rooms, the ceremonies that made him the center of everything, was a life so far beyond ordinary experience that for most people it existed only as an imagined thing, a fantasy, something you might dream of but could never touch. And Louis simply lived it every day as though it were ordinary, because for him it was. But here is the thing that haunts me about that sentence, living in a dream does not mean you are happy inside the dream. Saint-Simon, who was not given to sentimentality about Louis, also recorded the moments when the magnificence became clearly visibly insufficient. He noted that in the final years of the reign, as the deaths accumulated and the court emptied of familiar faces, Louis became quieter. Not outwardly, the composure held, the ceremonies continued, the Sun King did not flinch in public. But there was something in the evenings, in the long time spent in Maintenon's apartments with the door shut, that Saint-Simon described as a retreat from the court itself, as if even the man who had built the court needed eventually to stop performing inside it. The Princess Palatine, Elizabeth Charlotte, wife of Louis's brother Philippe, who wrote some of the most unvarnished letters in the history of European courts, offered a different kind of testimony. She had little fondness for Maintenon, and said so with remarkable directness. She was German, blunt, deeply uninterested in the social performance that Versailles required, and she found the whole machinery of the court faintly exhausting. But she watched Louis with the affection of someone who had known him for decades, and had come to understand him, even if understanding did not always mean approval. She recorded without apparent sentimentality what she observed when Louis was told of the simultaneous deaths of the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy in 1712, the grandson and granddaughter-in-law he had loved gone within days of each other in the measles outbreak we talked about earlier. She wrote that the king had gone very pale, that his hands were still, that he had said nothing for a long time, and that he had then quietly asked to be left alone. Just that. He asked to be left alone. For a man who had not been alone, truly physically alone since he was a small child, that request must have been almost impossible to actually grant. There was always someone. Physicians, valets, secretaries, guards. The machinery of kingship did not stop running because you were in pain. But people stepped back. For a short while they stepped back, and what Louis did in those private minutes no one recorded, because that finally was private. Now here is the question I've been circling all the way through this story, and which I want to put to you directly. Was Louis XIV lonely? Not in the banal sense, he was obviously never alone, never without company, never without an audience. But in the deeper sense was there inside all of that ceremony and grandeur a fundamental isolation, a sense that the person he actually was could not quite be seen by anyone who was looking. I think the honest answer based on everything in the historical record is yes, and I think it was structural rather than accidental. The role of Sun King was so total, so all-consuming, so designed to be a surface, rather than a person that genuine intimacy became almost architecturally impossible. The women who came closest to seeing through the surface were the ones who wanted nothing from the surface itself. Louise de la Vallière had loved him before she understood what she was getting into, which is perhaps why he felt so free with her. Maintenon, who had been born with nothing and built everything through her own intelligence, had no particular need of what he was offering, which is perhaps why he trusted her. Marie Mancini saw him most clearly of all, and was sent away. In a sense, the most honest relationship Louis ever had with another human being was the one he was forbidden to keep. And everything that came afterward was in various ways shaped by that prohibition, by the knowledge settled into his bones at 20 years old that being a king meant being seen by everyone and known by almost no one. Saint-Simon left one more observation about Louis that I want to share with you because it is both specific and strange and somehow more moving than most of the grand historical assessments. He wrote about the king eating, which was a ceremony of course. Louis dined publicly, formally watched by the court, waited upon by a procession of servants following elaborate ritual. But Saint-Simon was watching the man, not the ceremony. And what he noticed was this: Louis ate a great deal, an extraordinary amount in fact. Enormous meals consumed with relentless appetite day after day throughout his adult life. His stomach, the court physicians noted, was anatomically larger than normal. They discovered this at the autopsy. A man who ate like that, Saint-Simon observed, was a man who found in food something that comfort of a simpler, more animal kind. The one pleasure that required no performance, no audience, no political calculation. You could be hungry and then not hungry. It was comprehensible in a way that power never quite was. I find that detail more revealing than almost anything else in these pages. The most powerful man in the world with his too large stomach eating through the ceremony, finding a moment of something uncomplicated in every meal. He was human after all. He was just not allowed to show it in any other way. And then there is Maintenon's testimony. She burned most of her correspondence at the end of her life, knowing as she did so that history would lose something irreplaceable. What survives is partial fragments, extracts letters to friends that caught a corner of what she knew, but never the whole. What the surviving letters suggest across decades of private correspondence is a woman of remarkable clarity about what she had gotten herself into and what it cost. She wrote in a letter from May of 1709, 6 years before Louis died, that she lived at Versailles quite deserted because everyone young and old ran after favour, and those without favour found themselves invisible. She was surrounded by thousands of people and essentially alone. She knew better than anyone what Louis had built and what it had done to the people inside it, including himself. She administered the machine from the inside with characteristic intelligence and without apparent complaint. But the letters suggest quietly a weariness that she kept from the king's face as carefully as she kept everything else from his face. She wrote once in a line that has been quoted by historians studying this period that she did not know what she was, only that she could not become what others wished her to be. I think that sentence applies to Louis as much as to Maintenon. He spent his entire life becoming what others' France God dynasty ceremony required of him. What was left underneath when the performance finally stopped remains for the most part sealed. Here is what I believe, having spent this much time with this story. The loneliness of Louis XIV was not a failure. It was a consequence of something he chose or was chosen for before he was old enough to choose, and that he honoured with a consistency that is genuinely extraordinary. He could have been a different kind of king. He could have chosen quiet, chosen reform over magnificence, chosen to be a smaller person in a smaller world. He did not make those choices. He made the choices he made, and he lived inside them for 72 years with remarkable discipline and a private suffering that he permitted himself to express only in the smallest, most controlled doses a sleepless night, a quiet request to be left alone, the too large stomach of a man who found comfort the only place he was allowed to find it uncomplicated. The shortness of each day was his only sorrow. Saint Simon wrote that. He meant it, I think, as a gentle mockery, the great king who complained only that time moved too fast, who was never content to let a day be incomplete. But I read it differently. A man for whom each day was too short, who filled every hour with war and ceremony and governance and love affairs and construction projects and audiences, and evening conversations with a woman born in a prison. That man was not bored. He was not empty. He was running always from something or toward something that he could never quite name. The Sun King. The man who performed the sun for 72 years without a day off. I've wondered sometimes what he would have done with a Tuesday afternoon entirely to himself. I think he would not have known what to do at all. We've come a long way together in this story. From the rain-soaked autumn night when two people who rarely shared a room together produced improbably the child who had become the most famous king in European history. Through the Fronde and Mazarin's education, and the carriage door in 1659, and Louise's convent, and Montespan's darkness, and Maintenon's needlework, and the fistula surgery, and the 2,000 enemas, and the teeth that came out wrong. Through the children who died, and the grandson who barely survived, and the deathbed with the 5-year-old great-grandson who could not yet understand what he was being told. And now here we are at the reckoning. What do you do with a life like Louis XIV's? How do you weigh it? The honest answer is that you hold both sides at once, because neither side on its own is true. On one side, the longest reign in European history, the construction of Versailles, which stands today 300 years later as one of the most visited monuments on earth, the elevation of French as the language of civilization, the arts Molière, Racine, Lully, Le Nôtre elevated and patronized with a personal attention that no monarch before or since has quite matched, the transformation of France from a country riven by civil war and aristocratic rebellion into a centralized, internationally dominant state, the Hall of Mirrors, the gardens, the sheer physical evidence of what extraordinary resources directed by extraordinary will can produce. On the other side, 2 million people who died in famines during his reign, in a country that was simultaneously building the most expensive palace in the world. The 200,000 Huguenots driven into exile by a religious policy that crippled the French economy for a generation. The wars, 5 of them each more financially ruinous than the last, fought not for France's security, but for Louis's glory, and admitted by Louis himself on his deathbed to have been a mistake. The tax burden on the poor that laid the groundwork for the revolution that would destroy everything his descendants inherited. The court that replaced genuine governance with performance, and the aristocracy that forgot how to do anything except compete for the right to hand the king his shirt. Both sides are true, a person can hold both, but I want to leave you with something else. Not the political ledger that is for historians to argue over, and they will argue over it forever. I want to leave you with something smaller and more personal, because I think small and personal is where the truth of any human life actually lives. I want to leave you with the image of a 5-year-old boy being carried across the floor of the royal palace at night into a room full of strangers who wanted to verify he was real, lying perfectly still, breathing evenly, controlling his face. That boy became the Sun King. He spent the next 67 years performing, building, ruling, loving and losing and deciding and carrying a weight that would have broken most human beings in the first decade. And then he became an old man in a bed with gangrene moving up his leg, saying to the surgeon, "Do not treat me as a king. I want to heal as if I were a peasant." He never healed as a peasant. He died as a king. He had no other option. By then the role had fused so completely with the person that separating them would have required surgery more radical than anything Felix could provide. But he asked, and I find that small request, that single moment of wanting to be ordinary, to be the most human and the most moving thing in this entire extraordinary story. Saint Simon, for all his acidity, ended his account of Louis with something approaching respect. He wrote in the final pages where he described the end of the reign that the passing of Louis XIV was the passing of an age not only politically, but in some deeper sense, that the world which had organized itself around this one person for this one long period could not simply reorganize itself around someone else, that what had been built was too large and too specific to survive its builder. He was right. The world after Louis was different in kind, not just in degree. But Saint-Simon also noted, and I think he found this genuinely surprising, that the people who mourned Louis most sincerely were not the courtiers who had known him longest and benefited most from his favour. They were the ordinary people of France, the people who had never been to Versailles, who had seen the king, if at all, on the rare occasions when the royal procession passed through a provincial town and Louis had appeared briefly at a carriage window. The people who had paid the taxes and served in the armies and buried the children who died in famines while the fountains ran. Those people mourned him, because for all the cost of what he had built, he had given France something that is harder to name than a palace, or a language, or a system of government. He had given it an image of itself, a story about what France was and could be at its most magnificent. And people do not easily give up the stories that tell them who they are, even when the stories have cost them something real. The Princess Palatine, writing a few weeks after Louis's death, said something that I have been thinking about since I first read it. She wrote that she had not expected to grieve so much, that she had known intellectually that the end was coming. She had watched it coming for months. And yet, when it arrived, when the silence that followed the death announcement settled over Versailles, she found herself sitting alone in her apartments, unable to make sense of a world that did not have Louis XIV in it. She'd not always liked him. She'd disagreed with him often. She'd spoken about him with a candour that would have gotten a lesser person exiled. But she had organised her life around his presence for decades, and his absence produced a disorientation she had not anticipated. I think that is the most honest testimony about what Louis XIV meant to the people who knew him. Not that he was perfect, not that he was kind, not that the thing he built was worth what it cost, but that he was the fixed point, the thing that did not move while everything else moved around it. And when the fixed point was gone, even the people who had not fully loved it found that they did not know which way was north anymore. What do we do with that 300 years later? We remember him, not as the portrait, the ermine and the high heels and the sceptre and the face that gave nothing away, but as the person behind the portrait, the boy who lay still in the dark, the young man who cried at a carriage door, the king who asked his surgeon to treat him like a peasant, the old man who told a 5-year-old not to make the mistakes he had made. He was magnificent. He was flawed. He was beneath everything irreducibly human. The shortness of each day was his only sorrow. Sleep well. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for spending this time with me and with Louis XIV, who has been over these past hours better company than I expected. This story is one I have wanted to tell for a long time, not because Louis XIV is a simple subject to admire or condemn, but because he is a complicated subject to understand, and I believe honestly that understanding complicated people is one of the most useful and humane things we can do with our time. If this story moved you, surprised you, made you think about something differently, if any part of it stayed with you the way good stories sometimes do, I would love to know. Leave me a comment. Tell me which moment landed for you. Tell me which woman's story you found yourself thinking about. Tell me if you fell asleep at the fistula surgery, because that would be entirely understandable. And if you enjoyed this journey and you're not yet part of this community, please do consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting, more lives as complicated and as full as this one, more rooms with doors that close, more private moments in the margins of public history, more portraits that hide more than they show. There is always another story. I will see you in the next one.